Okay. All right. Go for it, Troy.
Oh, great. Well, thank you, Boris, and welcome everybody to the third meeting of the General Services Administration Acquisition Policy Federal Advisory Committee. I hope I don't have to say that 3 times really quickly because I'm amazed I could say it once. But thrilled to be here today to kick off our third meeting. We have a really packed agenda, so I'm going to be brief, but I think there's some important things to cover right up front. First of all, Boris and Stephanie, thank you so much for your support with your guidance and all the logistics. This is a lot for this committee to tackle. You make it so much the easier with all your amazing support. So thank you so much. And I'm scrolling down and I see Crystal Brumfield here, the Associate Administrator for Government-Wide Policy, I think, and she was a champion of the launching of this committee. Crystal, so great that you can be here today. Thank you so much for everything you're doing. Jeff Kosis is here, the Senior Procurement Executive of GSA, I think. I'm having to scroll down now through the attendees, but Jeff, we look forward to engaging with you, and thank you for your words of wisdom that you have offered as we've gone along the way. I want to thank all of the members of this committee. The participation rate has been outstanding so far. I really just in particular want to thank the subcommittee chairs and co-chairs. We have 3 subcommittees. You're going to hear from them today. They are putting in an immense amount of effort into this committee, and they are the backbone of this committee. It's a lot of hours. They have every other week, each subcommittee, 2-hour meetings, and in between that, there's a tremendous amount of planning and preparation that goes into this, and I think it shows really the seriousness with which this committee is taking its charge and the urgency that we feel in our mission to help GSA embed climate and sustainability considerations into acquisition. So I think that if I can say that the committee is off to a very strong start because of the outstanding work at the subcommittee level. So I just especially want to thank the subcommittee chairs and co-chairs. Just a couple of themes I see across the subcommittees as I've been able to observe some of their meetings. So much good work going on across the government already. We've had outstanding speakers from within the government, and we're going to hear from 2 others today, Tiffany and Paul. And I see a common theme across the subcommittees of really wanting to leverage and build on the very good work that's going on already and be able to have that as capacity as new concepts and policies come down the pike. I also just want to give a couple of shout outs to the subcommittees and their approach. Each and every subcommittee always has in mind how something can be implemented. This is not a committee of people who are just throwing out ideas without thinking about what they actually mean for the people who have to implement that, what it means on the private sector side. And I think that that's a great outlook for us to have. And just also want to give kudos to the subcommittees for on their own deciding that one of the most important things that they can do is come up for a mission statement for each subcommittee. And I think that's been incredibly important. It's not something that's required by the FAC law, but something the subcommittees have decided to do on their own. And I think it's really helping the subcommittees and our committee as a whole be able to communicate to the public what we're trying to do, to the federal acquisition workforce, to industry. It's been incredibly important. And in listening into the evolution of those discussions about what the mission statements are going to be, it's just reminded me how words are really important. And so I think you'll hear a lot today about the care with which each subcommittee is approaching its mission and which has helped inform what its priorities are going to be. So I'm just excited about the discussion today. We're going to hear from two really awesome guest speakers, then dive into getting to reports from the subcommittees. And so I think it's going to be a very informative day. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Cassius for any opening remarks he wants to make.
Oh, good. Thank you, Troy. I just want to again thank everyone for attending your participation today. As Troy mentioned, it has been a robust amount of information. A lot of effort has been put into the subcommittees, a lot of discussion, a lot of favorable discussion. So we're really excited about that. Without further ado, not to hold up where we are and keep us on track of time, of course, I'd like to also just acknowledge and thank Boris and Stephanie, the team, for helping to guide the rest of us where we are today, particularly the chairs, the co-chairs, and the committee members themselves. So, Boris, without further ado, I'd like to pass it to you, sir, and get us started on our way today.
All righty. Thank you so much. And Adam, you can put the slides back. Again, everybody, my name is Boris Savrati, and I'm at GSA. I'm the designated federal officer for the FAC. And we are off to a very strong start here. We've been really working together and pulling everything together to really get this committee off the ground. And the first thing I wanted to do before I get too far here, if you go to the next slide, Adam, just a reminder, I want to welcome our public participants that are at this committee meeting. This is our third meeting. We are operating under the Federal Advisory Committee Act, which actually happens to be a process that GSA also manages for the entire federal government. This act has been around since 1972. And essentially, we have been working under a process to engage the public, but also bring members to this committee that represent multiple sectors of our economy, and to bring ideas that will help the federal government really improve operations. It is a longstanding American tradition, so the FAC process is well established, and we have some really great guidance from our colleagues at GSA that manage the FAC process for the entire federal government. So if we go to the next slide, before I talk about the agenda, I did want to take a minute here just to note that our team is taking the role for the committee members. And so I will just say that we have, I'm going to just look at the beauty of the Zoom meetings. I can see who's here. Having to go through everyone. All right. So I just want to acknowledge that we have taken roll. We have the majority of our committee members present. And then, so I wanted to move to the agenda very briefly here. We have a very full program today. Couple of great speakers who are going to share with you about two very important programs at GSA. And then we're going to spend the majority of the afternoon hearing the reports from each of the three subcommittees who have diligently been working through the holidays and through storms and all of those things to really bring some really important updates together for you today. And then we're going to close out. And again, members of the public, one thing that we have enabled for this meeting is we have the Q&A feature, which you're able to use at any time during this meeting. If you have any comments, questions, and this will be something that we can capture and then we provide to the members of the committee for their consideration. So I wanted to make that clear. We do have a spot before we end the meeting where anyone could raise their hand, and then we'll guide you through that process when we get there, but we'll have some time for the public to chime in if there's anything you wanted to add. So I wanted to do this. We have some great guests here. I did want to acknowledge first, Crystal, so much. So glad to see you. Do you want to say hello just briefly for the folks here?
Absolutely. Thank you, Boris. And it's so good to see everyone. Happy New Year. I want to thank all of the committee members and committee chair and co-chair for the hard work that I know that you all have been, and time that you have been putting in since the beginning of the establishment of the FAC. I know and I'm hearing that the information that you all are sharing and ideas that you all are generating are ones that are innovative. And so I'm super excited to hear what the updates are. and also is equally excited to hear from Paul and Tiffany today about the programs that we currently have in place and how we can enhance those programs through the ideas that you all come up with. So thank you again for your commitment to GAPFAC and also your commitment to making sure that this acquisition system that we have and that we're using really is cutting edge. Thank you, and thank you. So back to you, Boris.
All right, thank you, Crystal. And so at this point, I also wanted to introduce our Senior Procurement Executive, Mr. Jeff Goses, who will do some briefing context setting for our presenters today, and then a couple of remarks as well. Jeff?
Thank you, Boris, and hello, everyone. Happy New Year. As you've been hearing through the briefings, through other conversations, GSA has long tried to think about issues of climate and sustainability. We hope that means you recognize we're not starting from zero. Today, you're going to hear from two of our leaders. They're going to talk about how we're currently trying to use the power of GSA acquisition to motivate prospective federal contractors, helping them to think, how do they move out on climate and sustainability? The two major programs that you're going to hear about today, they're called OASIS and Alliant. They're both at a similar stage. For both, we're in the process of planning that next generation solution. And for both, we recently issued draft solicitations for comment. Both draft solicitations are intended to give credit to bidders who report their greenhouse gas emissions. Quick word on each. OASIS is GSA's premier government-wide professional services family of contracts. It's designed around complex requirements, things across multiple disciplines, such as financial services, program management, engineering, logistics, and so forth. OASIS supports all contract types, and there's around 750 or so contractors in this generation. Nearly 600 are small, and since inception, government-wide obligations have topped $57 billion through the vehicle. Alliant is GSA's premier enterprise government-wide acquisition contract. You'll hear us use the word GWAC to cover a government-wide acquisition contract for IT. Alliant covers customized IT services and solutions for federal agencies. It's been a tremendously successful program, and the current generation includes climate and sustainability features. Alliant was designed for the high-dollar, most complex IT acquisitions. GSA has a full family of IT GWACs focused on the small business community, but Alliant is really designed around those big, high-dollar, incredibly complex tasks. We just increased the ceiling for that contract to $75 billion, and we're actively moving to replace it years ahead of plan. Tiffany and Paul are going to talk to you about how they both thought about climate's impact in their draft solicitation. I think the issues they're going to lay out for you are going to be of interest to all three of our subcommittees. And I encourage you, ask our presenters questions as they share the way that they've been thinking about this set of issues. Boris, really appreciate that, and back to you.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you. So without further ado, I want to introduce our first speaker today, Ms. Tiffany Hickson, who is the Assistant Commissioner for the Office of Professional Services and Human Capital categories. She's also serving as the Acting Regional Administrator for GSA's Northwest Arctic region. And Tiffany has been around GSA a while, and she really brings a wealth of knowledge, not only in acquisition, but all things around acquisition, and her leadership at GSA has just been really fundamental to a lot of the transformational changes the agency has. Hardly anybody in the office, and the minute we talked about what we're doing, Tiffany lit up and she said, yes, I definitely want to share with you all. So we without further ado, Tiffany, you got it. Oops. Yeah, did I cut out for a minute here? Okay, Tiffany, so I was just, hopefully everybody heard my remarks here. So we are really glad to have you here. And you can go ahead and take it from here.
Thanks, Boris. I appreciate it. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I did drop, in terms of titles, the acting regional administrator role last week. So that's one less thing to do. But one thing I did want to mention in terms of my federal roles is I still serve or do serve as the category manager or executive for professional services government-wide. And so in addition to the contract work that I do for GSA, I spend a lot of time talking to industry as well as federal agencies about their professional services and human capital requirements. So have kind of a unique perspective there as well as industry. So I'm really looking forward to your feedback. And if you don't have feedback today, that's okay. I'm going to push a lot of information your way. But if you can think about it, even after today, and give us some feedback as we get through the draft RFP process, I would really appreciate it. We weren't sure how read in you were in terms of some of the government-wide contracting work that we're doing. So today's discussion, I'm going to spend more than a few minutes or about maybe half of my time talking about the new contract program that we're putting in place, and then the sustainability features that we have baked into the draft RFP or request for proposals. We also are starting to get feedback from industry about those draft terms and conditions. So I thought I would share that feedback with you as well. I know that we've got a limited amount of time and I can be a bit of a chatty Cathy. So if you want to ask questions as we get through, just so we don't lose your train of thought in the chat, then maybe at the end we can round up the questions and have maybe a few minutes of dialogue around that, if that's okay with you, Boris and Stephanie. Is that okay?
Yep, that sounds good. Yep.
Okay, great. Next slide. Okay, so what is OASIS Plus? Our current contract program is called OASIS, and our next generation contract is OASIS Plus because there's a lot of plus in there. We've learned a lot of lessons over our current generation contract program, which I believe is in its 8th year. So a lot of lessons around small business access to the contract. How do we structure that into the terms and conditions? And access has been a huge theme that we have tried to address as part of standing up this contract program. But I'll walk you through what some of those unique features are, and almost all of them are really a reaction to listening to industry and our federal agency partners about what they needed in a government-wide contract for professional services. So it is a follow-on contract vehicle, but it's much broader than our current OASIS contract program. We are also structuring it to achieve the best-in-class contract standards that OFPP has laid out for federal agencies. So when we're done with this, hopefully we get the OMB Good Housekeeping seal of approval, right? And this is a best-in-class contract. And also we are focused on really attracting highly qualified contractors to this contract program. It is not a contract program for inexperienced contractors or contractors that aren't new to performing professional services. And I would also mention that this does not include IT services primarily. IT services can be part of a larger solution that is acquired under OASIS Plus, but the primary purpose of the contract is professional and human capital services. Next slide. The unique features that we are working to build into this new contract program is, one, it is not one contract program. It's actually, OASIS Plus is an umbrella name for a program that includes 6 standalone contract programs that are organized by socioeconomic category. And for those that may be familiar with the current OASIS program was not structured that way. It was actually structured around functional areas where you could do small business set-asides. For this generation of the contract program, it is actually structured by socioeconomic programs where you can buy different types of services under each one of those programs. And what we're calling domains under each one of these contract programs is really, we are pre-qualifying contractors based on their expertise. And in a couple of slides, I'll walk you through what those services are, but we're working on making sure that contractors are pre-qualified, have experience in specific domain or functional areas. Again, looking at very highly qualified contractors, not targeting new entrants in terms of their experience set. If they have not done work in the federal sector, that is fine, as long as they're an experienced company. The contract provides for both commercial and non-commercial services, as well as global access, right, to those services. So you can do overseas, it can be CONUS. Sorry, that's my first acronym. I promised our ASL interpreters I'd try to limit the acronyms, but that's our first one. But local and domestic services can be acquired through the contract program. So that part of the scope is pretty broad. We are also utilizing GSA's new, what we call 876 authority that was granted to GSA in the 2019 NDAA, which really drives pricing at the task order level. So we are looking at competition at the task order level based on actual requirements to drive pricing. There are no contract level pricing, so you're not going to see labor categories with rates on this contract program. Next, some other unique features, sorry, not next slide, just next in terms of features, is that this contract program will have no ceiling, and most importantly, no cap on the number of awards that we're going to make. So if a company qualifies and they're responsible, all the rest of those types of things, they would be able to receive a contract. So we're not restricting ourselves to only 60 contractors. If you qualify, you qualify, which is really a lesson learned from our previous contract vehicle. The ordering period is going to be 10 years, which is a little unusual for a non-IT contract. We're hoping that will bring some consistency in terms of competition, as well as participation from federal agencies across government. And because it's got a longer performance period, after we get through the initial source selection, instead of doing successive on-ramps, our intent at this point is actually to open the solicitations back up so they are continuously open through the ordering period. My guess is that as we get towards the end of the ordering period, we may stop taking new contractors because it may not be worthwhile for them or us, right, to bring them onto the contract. But at this point, after we get through initial source selections, we're looking at opening the contract back up. And that is something that we heard really loud and clear from federal agencies, that they would like their industrial base or new industry partners to be able to come onto the contract if they're qualified. Also, we are going to be using some technology-based ordering and market research tools that should make it much easier for ordering contracting officers and program managers to really do their market research online instead of having to issue really paper-based, even though they're electronic, requests for information. So we're really looking at leveraging technology to streamline that market research process for both industry and the federal acquisition workforce. Okay, next. The 6 contract programs that we will have under the OASIS contract family is an 8A set-aside contract program, Certified Hub Zone, Women-Owned Small Business, Service-Disabled Veteran-Owned Small Businesses, a Total Small Business Set-Aside, and then an Unrestricted Contract Program. And under each one of those contract programs, we'll have a series or a suite of pre-qualified industry partners. So if we go to the next slide, what you'll see under each one of those contract programs is a set of what we call domains. And so our first phase of awards, we are focused on technical and engineering, research and development, management and advisory assistance services, environmental, your favorite, intelligence services, enterprise solutions, facility services, and logistics. After we get through really setting up the contract with those domains and set of pre-qualified contractors, then we're going to focus on the next tranche of awards and domains, including financial services, business administration, human capital, marketing and PR, and social services. In addition to these domains, and we're focused on this first, we have allowed in the contract, in the solicitation terms and conditions, for us to be able to add additional domains in the future, should they become necessary. And given that we don't have a ceiling, increasing the scope is hopefully not going to be that much of a challenge, especially given that we're letting everyone know up front that this is something that GSA could do. And it's important, not just from it's a long period of performance, right? So we don't know what we're going to need in 10 years, and maybe these domains are insufficient. But this is also the only government-wide contract for non-IT services. So a lot of the flexibility that we built into the contract is really recognizing that this is it. Unlike the GWAC space for IT, there are a number of GWACs that are sponsored by GSA and other agencies. For government, this is the only government-wide contract that covers non-IT professional services. So we want to make sure that we're really baking in a lot of flexibility into the contract program. Okay, next slide. Where we are at on our milestones is we issued our first draft RFP in November. We recently closed the first comment period and are processing, the feedback that we got from industry. What's a little unique about this contract life cycle is that we are going to be issuing a second draft RFP. So our intent is to get all the feedback, process that feedback, make decisions about what we need to change, not change, and then issue a second draft RFP. So everybody can see up front, what that final RFP is going to look like, make sure that we hadn't missed something, or if there are some new considerations, right, that we need to bake into that final RFP. We've got another small window of opportunity to do that before the final RFP is issued. Our goal is to issue that by the end of the second quarter, or really first quarter of this calendar year, second quarter of the fiscal year. We also are hopefully going to start making awards this fiscal year as well. As you know, all big government-wide contract programs tend to have quite a bit of legal activity around protests and that kind of thing. We're hoping that given some of the flexibilities we built into this acquisition strategy, we may be able to mitigate some of that, but just crossing my fingers. Next slide. We have leaned forward in the draft RFP to really build in a whole series of sustainability evaluation criteria, as well as terms and conditions in the contracts themselves. And we are definitely getting feedback on what's in the RFP today. But we really took this from a place of, we know it's important, right, to set up this contract, given it does have a 10-year ordering period, to push the government towards our goal of net zero, right, greenhouse gas emissions, and position our industrial base to achieve, or at least work towards achieving those goals. By having these terms and conditions at the master contract level, ordering agencies don't need to worry about baking that into their own task orders. So that is really a streamlining effort on our part, and will make it easier for agencies to use it. They don't have to worry about those terms and conditions. We'll worry about it for them. It'll also bring increased efficiencies. So there isn't reporting at the task order level. It really is reporting at the master contract level, which we really feel is a benefit for industry in particular. It will, of course, reduce the negative impacts of climate risks by having these terms and conditions in our master contract. And it really is preparing our industrial base for FAR compliance for the new regulations that are currently being vetted or in the rulemaking process. So we're hoping to achieve that goal through this RFP, and which is actually a practice that we have done on our predecessor contracts, which is when we see things coming through the regulatory process, frequently we lean forward and put some of those terms and conditions in our government-wide contracts in anticipation of those things coming down the pike. All right, next slide. So currently, we've got the current FAR requirements for sustainability, and there are a number of them, but primarily FAR 52223-22 is included in the solicitation, which requires offerers in excess of $7.5 million in federal contract awards to represent whether they disclose greenhouse gas emissions. It does not require disclosure, and that's the current regulation. There is a proposed FAR rule, which I'm sure you all are familiar with, codifying much of the strategy that we have included in the Oasis Plus draft RFP. We understand that is open for comment, through January 13th, and based on feedback through the proposed rule, as well as feedback from this group and industry, right? We understand the terms and conditions in our draft RFP may need to change. Or maybe they're okay the way that they are, but that's what this process is really about, is that this discussion around what we really need to include in this contract program. And then, of course, we're working to make sure that all these terms and conditions are baked in so we can achieve that best in class designation. Next slide. For the pre-award evaluation criteria that we have in the RFP, and this is true for both contract vehicles, what you'll see in the what we call a qualification matrix, offerers are able to receive credit based on different views of either experience, past performance, business systems. Sustainability is one area of focus that we have in the evaluation criteria. And offerers are able to get 1 credit for publicly, like in terms of reaching, I probably should back up here for a minute. In terms of the evaluation criteria for Oasis Plus, for each one of the contract programs, whether it's unrestricted or small business, every offer has to achieve a certain point threshold. For small business, it is 36 credits out of 50. And I think for unrestricted, if memory serves me here, it's like 42 out of 50. And that's really the threshold for qualification. And each one of these elements, in terms of how we are looking at contractors' experience, we have assigned a certain number of credits that they can achieve towards reaching those point thresholds. So under sustainability, there is 1 point that offerers can achieve for publicly disclosing scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions. They can also get a credit for any of the following, which is publicly disclosing scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions or publicly disclosing science-based reduction targets. And for the environmental domain only, there is an additional credit or point that offerers can get if they are participating in the National Science Foundation's pilot for the ANSI 391-1, which is for general sustainability assessment of professional services. If you aren't familiar with that particular pilot program for professional services contractors, I found it really interesting and something that we may want to consider more broadly embracing from a federal contracting perspective. We've spent the last couple of years talking to the National Science Foundation about this particular standard, so would be interested in your all feedback on that if you have any at any point. Okay, next slide. Post-award, we also have a series of terms and conditions that contractors are going to have to comply with. These are focused right now at other than small business concerns under the Oasis program. And the first is post-award deliverables include sustainable practices, and impact statement has to be submitted within 12 months after issuance of their first task order. Not award of their master contract, but their first task order. For greenhouse gas reduction, progress report needs to be submitted within 24 months after issuance of the first task order, and then annually thereafter. And the report must include progress towards meeting greenhouse gas reduction targets or emissions resulting from the contract. And basically what we're looking at is complete the greenhouse gas emissions inventory, set a reduction target, report progress. That's pretty much the theme of each one of these deliverables, at least the goal. for each one of these deliverables. Next slide. Additionally, we are asking for a climate change risk management plan to be submitted post-award within 12 months after issuance of a first task order, and the plan has a series of requirements that at a minimum must be included, which is they need to identify what their process is for identifying, assessing, and responding to climate-related risks for successful performance and delivery of task orders under their contract. What inherent climate-related risks has the company identified that may have a substantive financial or strategic impact on their business? And then lastly, what is their business continuity plan? Those all need to be rolled into that risk management plan. These are all things that are in the draft RFP. Next slide. Also in that plan, just quickly, because I'm sure I'm pushing up against time here, is an overview of the actions that they've taken or opportunities they've identified to adapt to the climate-related risks that may have a substantial financial or strategic impact. We're also encouraging contractors to provide the location or their internet site, right, where this information can be made publicly available. And then we're requiring contractors to post their sustainability disclosures if they have any that are required on their webpage. This is the Oasis Plus webpage, but each contractor generally has a page where they're talking about the government-wide contracts they participate in. We're requiring that they post that on their website. Next slide. And feedback. So we had our first tranche of feedback that was submitted. We have received more than 2,000 questions that we are working through. In addition, we had published a survey asking for some very specific feedback. 400 companies responded to that survey. We are currently, this is a big caveat here, working through, that's a bunch of feedback, right, that we've got to get through. And we're currently working through aggregating and digesting the feedback. But based on our initial look and feedback that I am getting from, in particular, industry associations on the small business side, and we're hearing this from mid-sized companies as well, is that the sustainability factor in the pre-award environment, many companies won't be able to claim any credits towards that. So we may not see a lot of companies actually being able to earn points towards that point threshold, based on what we're hearing in particular for small businesses, that small businesses don't have the resources to measure greenhouse gas emissions. Lots of concerns around increasing costs for performance, that there isn't enough time for companies, right, to earn credits as part of coming onto the contract. We've heard some feedback from industry associations that while we may have these more stringent requirements in our contract, if the proposed rule, right, doesn't reflect what's in the contract down the road, it could be easier for contractors coming onto the contract later than it was for contractors coming on now. Fair point. And it's not common, right, for small and mid-sized companies to be tracking greenhouse gases. And really, there's been an ask for us to remove, at least up front from an evaluation perspective, the requirement or the evaluation criteria that we have baked in for getting on the contract. All right, next slide. And I think we probably don't have time for questions, but I'm happy to get back to everybody on it.
So, no, I appreciate it. So I'm going to send it back to Troy in a minute. So we will hold questions till after Paul is done for both you and Paul, if that's okay. If you can stick around, Tiffany.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tiffany. This is fantastic. By way of background, I scribbled down a lot of questions I see in the chat. Some of our committee members have others. So I think we should just move forward, Boris, and go to Paul so that then we can get back and get to the Q&A session with Tiffany and Paul. That was amazing, Tiffany. Thank you so much.
All right, okay, this is Paul. I'll be glad to take over now, and I'll talk about what we did with Alliant 2 and what we're looking at with Alliant 3. If we can go to the next slide. Just so you know, the Alliant family of GWAC started back with an award in 2009 for Alliant. That ran for 10 years. Starting around 2014, we began working on Alliant 2. We put it out on the street in 2016. It was awarded in late 2017 with a notice to proceed in 2018. When we built with Alliant 2, we looked at environmental objectives and requirements, what greenhouse gas reporting we should put in at that point. And in the agenda, we'll talk about what we're looking to do with Alliant 3. If we can go to the next slide. Now, as we built Alliant 2, starting back around 2014, we knew that there were some environmental objectives that the government was looking to achieve. There were some executive orders. There was the one in 2018, 13834, and subsequent ones which came. We recognize that greenhouse gases have a negative impact for the economy, and it was something that the government was interested in. So we looked at how we could address that. We intend to understand and reduce the impacts from our contracts. Now, our contracts, the GWAC, they're for IT services. Under Alliant 2 and under Alliant 3, we don't primarily have hardware, we don't have construction, we don't have things like that. Our primary work is development and integration of IT services. That's where the majority of our work is. In both Alliant 2 and Alliant 3 will be unrestricted contracts, where, as Jeff talked about earlier, we tend to have the largest, most complex IT requirements in the government. On Alliant 2, through its first 4 years, we had an average of 68 completed task orders a year, averaging near $120 million each. And for us, a primary concern has been effective competition. And this came from our clients. Originally, it was something that DPAP we worked with back around 2015 and continued to be a priority, particularly for DoD. An effective competition is having 3 or more bids. So we've built a lot around there. We're cognizant of the greenhouse gas and climate related rule, which is out for comment until, I believe, February 13th. So if we can go to the next slide, I'll talk about what we did on Alliant 2. So we wrote this back around 2015. And it was the first IDIQ, and a GWAC is an IDIQ. A GWAC is an IDIQ for IT services approved by OMB. We were the first ones to incorporate greenhouse gas reporting as post-award deliverable. We had a section G25, which discussed what was required. Starting within a year of the NTP, all of the awardees had to file the disclosures and have them publicly available. Within a year after those initial disclosures, they had to conduct a complete greenhouse gas inventory. And then within 24 months of the first disclosures, they had to set target reductions. And then they have 12 months after that to start reporting on how their target reductions are going. So this was all written in 2015, put out in the street in 2016, awarded 2017, and became effective with the NTP in 2018. We're very proud of that. The prime contractors have to provide evidence of ongoing emissions, greenhouse gas reduction goals, and the actual achievements against those. The data collected from the contractors supplied annual corporate reports from their Carbon Disclosure Project database or other sources such as their own website. They can list them there. Why don't we go to the next slide? Now, the results were, when Alliant 2 was first awarded, we had 60 awardees. Now, the way that Alliant 2 was built, we stress heavily performance-based contracting measures. They have to meet certain performance requirements to stay on the contract. In addition to that, we have a requirement that no company, no entity can have more than one Alliant 2 contract. So from 60, we went down to 40. We lost about half of those from companies that were not able to maintain the performance standards. And we lost about half of them because companies merged with other Alliant 2 awardees. So at this point, we have 40 awardees. And of those 40 awardees, 18 of them have received waivers that they have no reportables or minimal greenhouse gas emissions for 2022. Of the 18 that received waivers from GSA, 8 of the 18 do have a minimal amount of greenhouse gases that they are reported, but it was low enough that they were still granted a waiver. And 22 of the 40 currently have reportable emissions. And I think that's important as we talk about how things will go in the future as far as reportable emissions. If we can go to the next slide. All right. Now, when we issued the first draft RFP for Alliant 2, we initially followed what we had done on, for Alliant 3, we initially followed the Alliant 2 model, where we were not going to have the greenhouse gas disclosures be an evaluated score for initial award. We planned on doing post-award and deliverables as we had done on Alliant 2. That had worked well. Now, we've subsequently, on January 5th, we updated our draft RFP to align with what Oasis had done, where we make greenhouse gas reporting an evaluation factor for award. For us, the two factors are 1,500 points for scope 1 and scope 2 reporting and 1,500 points for scope 3 reporting. So it's a maximum of 3,000 points potentially, or 3.8% of the total points that can be achieved by an offerer. At this point, we don't have listed additional ongoing contractual required reporting at this point. Now, we had planned on our initial draft RFP was ending, I believe it was January 6th or 7th. And we had received 650 questions and comments to date on that. But with the draft update of January 5th, we've extended that through the end of January, and as we put in the greenhouse gas. So we haven't received comments yet back on this change on the greenhouse gas update. If we can go to the next slide. Now, the big factor here is, we have made greenhouse gas reporting an evaluated factor. Now, if I'm Paulco and I'm going to bid on one of these contracts, I have to make a determination on whether or not I can do this greenhouse gas and receive these points. That may be a cost for the companies to do that. So they have to make a business decision on whether putting these reports out to them is worth the points that they will receive. The proposed FAR rule that's out there now, which I believe the comments were extended through January, breaks it down by revenue, the size that they have of annual awards on what they have to report. They're exempt from reporting under 7.5 million. From 7.5 to 50, the significant contractor, they have to report scope 1 and 2, and over 50 million a year, they also have to report scope 3. Our average award is $116 million. So effectively, if you get on to Alliant 3 unrestricted GWAC and you have success, we would expect that you would be determined a major contractor and have to do all of this reporting. But when we go back and look at what we had from Alliant 2, only 22 out of the 40 current contractors, all of which have already met the performance metrics, have actually been required to report all the way through because this is IT services. They don't necessarily have a lot of greenhouse gas disclosures to put in. We aren't the experts on greenhouse gas. So we're looking for expertise on how to proceed with greenhouse gas from the subject matter experts within GSA. I know I went through this pretty quickly, but I think the key points are the change from it being a post-award deliverable to an evaluated factor, and then the impact that's going to have on industry on whether or not they cede those points or they actually do that reporting to get those points. So, and I think that is my last slide.
Okay. Thank you, Paul. We appreciate that. And we're going to have some questions and answers coming up really soon. I did want to take the opportunity to introduce our first committee. And I believe we are still on with Steve and
Hey, guys. Hey,
Oh,
Cassius.
yes.
Actually, we're gonna go ahead and do Q&A with Tiffany and Paul now. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep,
Okay.
yep. Yeah, and you and Troy can moderate this section
Okay.
of that. Okay.
Sounds good.
Yeah, that's great. And Tiffany and Paul, thank you so much. Just amazing overviews of what you're doing. And I was scribbling down a lot of questions as I went along, but maybe I'll start with kind of one overarching question of like how we are going to be able to make things easier for vendors to work with the government on this. And Paul, you were talking about this and making greenhouse gas emissions more easily reportable. What are some of the lessons you've learned there? What are ways that we can make this more of a regular course of business and not something that vendors are really struggling with?
The greenhouse gas reporting requirements on Alliant 2 are something that they cause, there's a lot of confusion there for industry and subsequent work for GSA. Do they report at the corporate level? Do they report at the legal entity level? Putting through for the waiver. Then we have companies that have put in waivers, yet they still reported a small amount of greenhouse gas. It really comes down to having as much clarity in the requirements as possible for industry to try to minimize any confusion, put down what we want, how we want it, make it as clear as possible, because any ambiguity and confusion for them. When it comes to an evaluated factor for award, that opens us up for more protests when it comes to the actually awards. Once we move something over to make an evaluated factor, that's fair game now for protests, for award protests. We weren't clear about this, we weren't clear about that, as far as we went there. So we have to be crystal clear on how we do that. Now, when we do the actual reporting, what they're required to do, whether it's as an evaluated factor or subsequent through deliverable, it's very important that we make it clear. Legal entity, corporate, both, where they're going to post it, if waivers are even possible, and then the process for going in for waivers. If we're doing it as an evaluated factor, the whole concept of waivers becomes more problematic because we don't have waivers as part of an evaluation factor insofar as giving points.
This is Tiffany. I think, and we've started some of this work already. Within GSA, we have a services marketplace, a working group, which is actually more than a group. It really is a whole conglomeration of FAC leaders across multiple services contract programs that come together to start to work through how we can really align those requirements so it's easier for industry. So for Alliant 3 and for Oasis Plus, we have started to look at how do we have consistent requirements across the contract vehicles so the reporting requirements are the same. We don't always achieve, right, those goals, but those are some of the things that we are starting to work through collectively, which is why does Alliant have these terms and conditions, and why does Oasis have different terms and conditions? How can we really mitigate some of that so it's easier for industry? And there's a lot of industrial overlap, or some industrial overlap between the GWACs and our program, as well as MAS. So, what we're really starting to be much more thoughtful about is, in each one of these major contract programs, how do we align the terms and conditions so you can have consistent reporting? The reports can be used across contract programs, that kind of thing. I don't think that we've solved the challenge yet, but it's definitely something that's on the radar screen and that we are working with, at least in the FAC space. If that makes sense.
Great, thank you. And I'm looking toward the chat here. There's a lot that's going on. I hope that the subcommittee chairs and co-chairs will allow me the approach of maybe like some of our members who are not chairs or co-chairs of the subcommittees could jump in here. So I'm just scrolling down. Nigel, you had a question. Do you want to jump in and ask your question, or do you want me to read what's in the chat?
I can do that. That's fine. Thanks, Troy. Just looking at the presentations, it looks like Oasis Plus has a rather robust small business strategy in order to ensure participation. What is the plan for Alliant in order to make sure that non-large businesses, right? It could be small or mid-sized firms, are afforded the greatest opportunity to participate in that. And is there, I don't see any opportunity for a prime contract portion of that. So if not, then is there going to be a robust subcontracting and enforceable subcontracting requirement?
Absolutely. Now, one thing about Alliant is the GWACs. We have small business GWACs as well, so we have those. Now, Alliant 2 and going into Alliant 3, I am exceptionally proud of what we're doing for small businesses. Now, we have always had under Alliant 2 one of the strongest subcontracting requirements and reportables. 50% of all subcontracted dollars over the life of the contract have to go to small businesses. Now, we have up to this for Alliant 3. In addition to it, we've added some additional elements. We actually, we have a focus on emerging technology, because emerging technology becomes a lot of what we do. We do a lot of artificial intelligence, robotic process automation, distributed ledger technology. Now, what we have done as an evaluated factor is for other than small businesses for award, other than small business offerer can actually gain points by going out and meeting with small businesses that have up to 5 different emerging technology solutions, and working with them, meet with them to learn about them, to foster those relationships between the other than small businesses and the small businesses. So we've got an evaluated factor. Now, a small business proposing on Alliant 3 gets those points right away. It's only the other than small businesses that have to go out and can get those points that the small businesses get. Then, once we actually have awards on Alliant 3, in addition to the robust small business subcontracting goals that we have and reporting, we have measures in that their past performance rating are going to be related to it. We are updating on, they're going to be getting, I told you we have performance metrics on Alliant 2. We've updated them in Alliant 3 so that we're actually encouraging more proposals with subcontracted to small businesses. In addition to that, we have mandatory participation in matchmaking events that we'll have with small businesses. So it's an unrestricted vehicle, but we take small businesses very seriously. I think what we've done on Alliant 2 was absolutely leading, and we've enhanced it for Alliant 3. You're on mute.
Sorry, if I could just jump one quick point. So is that tier 1 subcontracting pursuant that we also be applicable to the, I think it was August 20th of last year, that allowed first tier subcontractors, small businesses, to get credit for record of past performance as if it was their prime contract. Would
This
that
would be, yeah, direct subcontracting. And it's funny, when we actually went to work and went through USA Spend and actually went through some of our awards, when you look where the money actually went, the number of contracts that these individual companies, that these individual awards reach is really quite staggering. Again, our average award is 116 million. We're planning on having 60 awardees, which, given we only have an average of 68 competed task orders a year, that's appropriate for us to maintain effective competition with our performance metrics.
and GSA will be tracking the new entrants as well as, so we're not using the same tier one subcontractors over and over again. So we're promoting bringing new participants to the supply chain for the federal government.
I am not going to swear on an answer because off the top of my head, I can't pull that out, but I know that we actually have different levels based upon the different socioeconomic categories within the small business community. So we're actually setting goals and following and directing through that level.
So Tiffany and Paul, I'm sensing from the questions that are coming in that we're going to want additional time with you at another session. But for now, if we could, why don't we go to Rich and then Nicole and Kristen, if you wouldn't mind coming off mute and posing the questions that you were teeing up.
Well, I got a good response from Jeff just a second ago, and my question was the scope and industry sectors addressed by OASIS and Align are interesting and cutting edge, but they're not the primary source of industrial pollution. Construction, contracting, automotive, leasing, and other related industry sectors put out a lot more GHG than professional service firms. So to what extent will GSA address those sources of GHG and emissions that are far more far more susceptible to change and mitigation? And thanks, Jeff. Appreciate your comment.
And Jeff's comment in the chat was that's a great conversation for the policy subcommittee. So that's something we can pursue. I think Nicole, you're up next, and then I also see a couple of hands up from Daryl and Amlan. So I will, yeah, if we could maybe be brief here, since we're bumping up on time, I'd love to get to all of you.
So to both Tiffany and Paul, I'm just really curious about how GSA is thinking about assessing the information that it receives through these climate risk plans and through the post-award reporting. Is it an expectation that individuals inside GSA will be assessing what's in front of them, or is a box just getting checked, and is a common template expected to move forward with respect to this reporting? Connected with the acquisition workforce subcommittee. So we're trying to think through how we anticipate the needs for transitioning this workforce towards assessing sustainability and acquisition. Thank you.
I'll start, which is, even for OASIS, we have collected some information. For OASIS Plus, we do have standard templates, right, that we'll be collecting and that are in the contract itself in terms of post-award deliverables. What we do with that data, our contracting officers and our contracting officer representatives, so we've got program people, will be reviewing those to make sure that they're compliant, right, with the spirit of what we've got in the template. What we actually do with that data, I think, is an open question. Some of it could be proprietary. I guess we'll have to take a look at the data when it comes in. Some of it is required to be published publicly, right? In particular for those things that are required for companies with over 7.5 million in revenue, which for our contract program is going to be a lot of companies. As mentioned for Alliant, the task orders that we have going through even our current contract program for small businesses, the award values are pretty high. So some of that is going to be public as part of the requirement, but I do think it's an open question in terms of what do we do with the data? Do we sanitize it? Do we share it in some way? We have, and I think Paul did it, or I'm sorry, Paul, yeah, did a really good job of talking about how we have assessed the information, right? But we're not out publicizing that anywhere unless we're talking on a panel like here. So I think that probably is an area that getting your feedback on what we could do with it be a good thing.
I agree that this is something good to look at. I know that our reports, we send them back to Jed. He's the one who's doing the assessment, putting it together, issuing the waivers or not. So through the reports that have been through Alliant 2, some of that data already exists within GSA, and they're working it because they're the ones who actually are providing the waivers or not. So we just need to make sure that we have as we go forward, that we staff that robust enough to actually handle all that's going to come in.
And let me just follow up, because you say you assess the data. Can you give us some sense of what that means?
I actually can't, because I'm not the one doing the assessment. I apologize about that, but I know that it is looked at as far as totaling it, as far as issuing the waivers, as making the determination of whether or not the waivers are acceptable or not. And as we move forward, all GSA vehicles doing this, that is a really good question on how are we going to best utilize this information, which we have some of which already.
Yeah. And I think for us, right, we know what it is that we want to see. I think in terms of establishing the standards for, our technical personnel or our cores, we're going to have to disclose that, right, to industry, which is here's the standard. It shouldn't be shooting in a barrel, right, after fish or whatever. I'm really bad at analogies, by the way. But it really needs to be clear in terms of what those standards are for our staff, as well as for industry. So it's not like this isn't good enough, do something else. So we're in the process of working through that now for our next contract program. And then again, behind the scenes, right, we're working across our major government-wide contracts to talk about what's working, what's not working, where can we align, really to have the same standards, same templates, where we can't, why can't we? It's a pretty methodical process that we actually have a whole subcommittee that is focused on answering some of these questions across our big government-wide contract programs.
Great, thanks. We have a few minutes left, and I know we have a few hands up. Kristen, I think you had some comments.
One of the committee members at large.
That's fantastic. So, and I apologize. I don't know like whose was up first, but I saw Daryl, Amlan, and Kimberly. So why don't we go in that order?
Okay, thank you. My question is really kind of quick. I heard that for small businesses, they could only be second tier. So are we doing something? Are you doing something so that small businesses can be first tier and prime contractors?
I'm assuming that this is for me, Paul.
It is.
We have Polaris out right now, which is a small business GWAC. When you look at OASIS, it has multiple socioeconomic categories. The way that including an unrestricted, the way that GWACs are built is we have separate small business GWACs. So we have small business GWACs specifically for them. It's just Alliant happens to be the unrestricted vehicle. That's the way that we have chosen to do them. Effectively, OASIS Plus, it'll be a series of different contracts with socioeconomic categories under the Oasis Plus umbrella. We're Alliant family is our unrestricted. We had Alliant 2, and we'll have Alliant 3, which will be unrestricted. And on the small business side, we've got Polaris, which is actually in evaluation right now. And there are 4 socioeconomic categories under that. We've got Vets 2, and we've got 8A stars as well.
Okay, so then Alliant doesn't kick out small businesses if they want to compete in an unrestricted way, they can. And okay.
When we
But
had
then you have
Alliant
some
2,
Polaris that's set aside for the small business.
right. On Alliant 2, we had small business awardees. Once they were successful, they didn't stay small business long, but we had small business awardees.
Okay,
That's true for Oasis Plus as well, where even for our unrestricted category, it's unrestricted. Any company can come in. If you qualify, you can come in. Doesn't matter what your socioeconomic status is. The other contract programs are just focused on those socioeconomic programs. So there's no restriction.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you both. And so Amwan, I think you were next.
Yes, I'll be very quick with this. Thank you for the presentations on these 2 programs. And I was, the Green Building Advisory Committee within GSA, they came up with a specification for environmentally preferred asphalt and low carbon concrete. And so kind of also piggybacking on what Richard was mentioning about construction materials, I was wondering where those specifications fit in within the 2 programs. We discussed it, like you presented to us today, and I'm just trying to figure out where that fits in with the broader discussion. Thank you.
They don't fit into my contract program or Oasis or really any contract program that I am responsible for. If, let's say GSA awarded a task order under our contract program that had some small element, right, of asphalt, that kind of thing, I mean, you could expect to see those specifications, built in at the task order level, but the primary purpose of the contract is not construction. So you're probably not going to see a lot of that in the contract, at least for GSA's contracts.
Yeah, same for the GWACs. They're IT services in nature. When we track our work, most of our work is development and integration of IT systems, software, things like that. So we don't really get into anything like construction. If something ancillary is needed to support the IT services, but asphalt and things like that really would generally not be expected to ever show up.
Unless you were laying a conduit or something, right, in a parking lot that need to be asphalted over, right? You might have some specifications for that, but it's pretty minimal.
Right.
And Kimberly, I think you're going to close us out here with the final question.
Sure, thanks. So thanks again, Tiffany and Paul, for the presentation. Just 2 quick things. I wanted to come back to Nicole's question about the GHG reporting requirements and the data that you guys are getting in. One thing that it would be helpful to know from you guys as you're looking at that data is how does the data actually demonstrate progress towards GSA's sustainability metrics in some way? So if there's a percentage that you're looking for reductions, how does that data help support those goals as one? And then 2, also related to that, I think, Paul, you mentioned that you guys had transitioned or are transitioning the GHG reporting, some of that to the pre versus the post award stage. And so how does that, or did it impact the submissions and those being able to qualify, not just small businesses, but even some of the large and mid-sized businesses?
Yeah. As far as the first part of your question about the data that's there now, I'm not in a position to answer that now, but that's something that I think that we can get you an answer for on what they're actually doing with the data that has been submitted, how the waivers are put in, et cetera. As far as your second part of the question, again, we just put this amendment out, I think last week, where it's an evaluated factor up front. And, companies are going to have to make it, if that stays, companies are going to have to make a determination. Can they afford to do this work to get those points to possibly get an award. That's something they're going to have to make a determination about. On Alliant 2, where we did do it as a post-award deliverable, where we raised the bar each year and what they had to report. Even when we did that, you can see that only 22 of the 40 awardees we have right now actually go up that step ladder because of the amount of greenhouse gas is they actually have to report. And they're generally, I believe, reporting at the corporate level versus the legal level. The legal level is the company that gets the award on the contract. The corporate level is they could be owned by a company that's owned by a company that's owned by a company, and their roll-up could be a lot more greenhouse gas. And I think that's why we're seeing even 22 of the 40 reporting at that level. Other issues that have come up, even with that, is their reporting sometimes is done based upon their corporate fiscal year versus either the contract year anniversary of the awarded contract or the government fiscal year. So we have to take that into account too. Does the start of any deliverables afterwards, is it from the NTP, the notice to proceed of the contract? Is it from the government fiscal year? Is it from the corporate fiscal year? Now, the corporate standard is to report at the corporate level and do it based upon their own fiscal years. So I don't have answers to those, but those are just things that have come up as we've gone on.
Yeah, and I appreciate that too, Paul, because I just wonder, as you guys are moving through that process, does it having at the pre-award stage present a significant barrier to diversify your supplier chain, right? And so it's just something to really consider as what you're getting in.
Mm-hmm. I don't know how that will come out. I'm sure that we'll be getting some feedback on it. I'm sure that Oasis Plus already has significant feedback on it. Because doing this is going to represent a cost, and be it in time, actual money to industry to actually do this in anticipation of receiving an award versus you've got the award, here's a deliverable performance measure of your contract.
Thanks, Paul.
And just one note or follow up on, do these requirements further GSAs, right? Climate reduction goals. Well, these contracts actually are mostly used by other agencies. So I think the question is, are they really furthering the federal government's climate reduction goals? And I think we really need to look at it through that lens, because the majority is spent through the contracts is actually not GSA dollars. So just food for thought as we're looking at the challenge.
Yeah, that's a great point, Tiffany. And Tiffany and Paul, thank you again so much. This has been so much valuable information. As you can tell by the questions, you've got our minds churning as to how we can process this information and use it. If you don't mind, I think the members did have some questions in the chat. We'd love to forward to you just to see if you have some helpful information you can forward along to us. And as I said, this has been very valuable for us. I think we'll want to be touching base with you again in the future, but thank you so much for your time today and for everything you're doing with Oasis and Alliant, and we look forward to continued discussions with you.
Thank you very much.
So I think we're a tiny bit over, but not drastically over. I think I'm kicking it to Cassius now to tee up the first of our subcommittee discussions.
First one. Thank you, Troy. We want to kind of jump into our, as Troy mentioned, our first discussion, our subcommittee. We are going to kick off first with the Policy and Practice Subcommittee, led by Dr. Steve Schooner and Luke Basis. So without further ado, Dr. Schooner, mic's all yours.
And I have to admit, even though I'm on Zoom every day, somehow or another, I have lost the ability to get my slides in front of me, and I believe I have it now, so I apologize for that slight hiccup. Okay. Let me first say, before I go forward, in this brief discussion, I'm going to be going back and forth with my co-chair, Luke Bates. I'll come back to that in just a moment. But I did want to say, as I start, a few introductory things with regard to the subcommittee. First, I want to be unequivocally clear that as a substantive matter, we did not choose the color for our background. Those were randomly assigned. And there should be no conclusions drawn from the colors of the individual subcommittees. My understanding is they were purely done to differentiate the committees, not to reflect what you might think of as a classic kind of traffic light type analysis. Next, as Troy and Cassius have mentioned, I'm cognizant of the time, and I'm relatively confident based on our discussions earlier that we should be able to stay on topic. But I'm also cognizant that as we go first, I'm hopeful that all of our mistakes will inform the other subcommittees and they can be more efficient, more professional, more informative, and the like. But again, one of the most interesting things about what we're talking about has been the learning curve, and the learning curve is enormous. And I'll come back to that as well, too. But with that, if I could get the next slide, please, in terms of what we're going to do. Okay. What we're going to try to do in relatively short order is talk very, very briefly about our wonderful subcommittee. We're going to try to give what could be seen as a disappointing update on our status to date. We're going to introduce where we are in terms of the evolution of our mission statement. And then we're going to spend a fair amount of time with our priorities and our topical focus. But rather than just jump into the topics themselves, in the back of your mind, I hope you're thinking about a few basic things as we begin that discussion with the plenary group. First, again, the potential task is enormous. So we're trying to be relatively transparent about the guidelines and the guardrails that we're using to try to move in the direction we're moving in. Next, our perception is there's an almost unlimited breadth and scope of the menu that we're choosing from. And so we wanted to give a little bit of insight as to how we're narrowing our focus. And then the last thing that we want to do, and I think we're going to try to do this in two different ways, but it does seem like one of the biggest challenges for our subcommittee is being able to let go of issues and let other subcommittees deal with them. And one of the hard things is there's different elephants in the room for everyone. But our sense is that if we're going to make any progress, we're going to have to concede we can't do everything. And there are a couple of very, very important issues that ultimately other subcommittees probably have a better shot at dealing with than us. And then, of course, we'll conclude with our next steps. Can I get the next slide, please? So for anybody who's unfamiliar with our outstanding subcommittee, I don't want to spend the rest of the day, let alone the week, talking about how awesome the group is. But I do want to remind particularly members of the public that there are short biographical statements for all of our subcommittee, and in fact, all of the committee members on the public-facing webpage. But I hope what you'll see from this is the group is not only extremely experienced and knowledgeable, but diverse in the most valuable sense of the word. It is diverse demographically. It is diverse in terms of the interests or the stakeholders' voices that they represent. And it is diverse in terms of where these people sit, including people who bring the perspective of the federal government, of state and local governments, of regional instrumentalities, of the private sector, and the like. So again, it is a wonderful subcommittee. Having said that, there's always the potential that to some extent, that's a little bit of a blessing and a curse, but I'll come back to that as well. Could I get the next slide, please? Okay. At least so far, like the broader or the plenary committee, we have had, I think, some really interesting discussions of our incredibly broad mandate. And so a quick example might be just thinking about the first two speakers that we've heard from in our subcommittee. So one of them gave us a little bit more of a, shall we say, narrow or focused approach, speaking primarily about how GSA is thinking about managing or reducing government reliance on single-use plastics. So let's call that a discrete or a narrow or a micro issue, one of an unlimited numbers of incredibly vexing problems that could be all time consuming. At the other end of the spectrum, our second speaker, interestingly enough, had only spoken at another one of the subcommittees a couple of days before. And again, just kind of a reminder about the overlap, but we were able to fully employ the same speaker only with regard to questions and answers, and we only scratched the surface. But again, that speaker's primary presentation had been to another subcommittee, reminding us how much overlap there is between the work that all of us are doing. But again, I think at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Luke for a while to talk a little bit about where and how we've gotten to where we've gotten with regard to our mission statement and the topics that we'll be talking about.
Thank you, Steve. Can you guys hear me? Great. Good afternoon, everybody. I am more than pleased to report that we are approaching a consensus on our mission statement. Thanks to the ambitious pen of a small group at our last meeting, led by Dr. Kimberly White, we have a working mission to present today. And you will hear, I think you're gonna hear from all the subcommittees that the drafting and finalization of a mission statement has become a labor of love for some of us. While it serves as the foundation upon which each committee will channel their energy and find guidance as we occasionally drift into ambiguity, which we are bound to do, we also understand that the mission statement is not meant to serve as a restriction for any areas of exploration, but more of a guiding light and an articulation of the fundamental principles that are important to recognize in order for us to move forward. As someone who has served primarily on transactions-based committees in the past, I did not have an appreciation for how difficult this exercise would be. Thank you to the subcommittee members who participated in the lively discussion and debate who got us here. It's clear that you all recognize the importance of having a working mission to allow us to move forward, create a curriculum of speakers and areas for study and set priorities. We've also now begun our discussion of priorities in earnest. On January 5th, the subcommittee had an active session taking the previously identified priorities and placing them on a whiteboard where the x-axis signified a level of effort and the y-axis signified level of impact, allowing us to come up with, I guess what I would characterize as a preliminary hypothesis as to which of our priorities may be appropriate for quick wins, low-hanging fruit, or long-term big picture priorities. We'll discuss the results in more detail in the next couple of slides. But at this point, I think it's safe to say Steve and I both agree that we have at least one more subcommittee discussion warranted in order for us to really paint a cohesive narrative with respect to our priorities that the subcommittee can get behind and move forward on. On the next slide, let's take a look at the draft mission statement. So this is our current working draft. Recommend actionable changes to GSA procurement policies and practices that encourage innovation and streamline the acquisition process to accelerate the demand and utilization of goods and services to achieve measurable progress on climate and sustainability goals. So what we see here has really been the evolution of a mission statement that began with a fairly simple version, utilizing words from the initial Federal Register and the concept of actionable recommendations that have significant and measurable impact. Over a couple of good meetings and several spirited discussions, we got some good input from all committee members, and some additional concepts were raised, such as encouraging innovation, strengthening the country's industrial base, ensuring recognition of the role small businesses will play, accelerating demand or influencing the private sector, and streamlining the process for acquisition for sustainable goods and services. I think if we go to the next slide, Steve will take us through a breakdown of the working draft.
So again, with apologies for any adverse impacts we may have by the use of color here, all we were trying to do was get you to focus on how densely packed this relatively efficient mission statement is. And I think, or we think, there's a number of pretty important messages here, and we just wanted to emphasize them briefly. So first and foremost, our understanding is that this advisory committee was created to advise. So we are recommending, we are not implementing at the end of the day. So we understand that we have limits. Second, from our first meeting, we were charged, as we understood it, by GSA to come up with things that were actionable. In other words, it was not necessarily our goal to come up with theory or concepts or fantasies. We weren't supposed to be recommending it if it couldn't be turned into an actionable change. The next, I think, for many of us is one of the most difficult concepts, and that is we were created and we ultimately serve the General Services Administration. Any of you who were with us at our first meeting will recall the administrator of GSA was here, and we have been pleased to have the involvement of Jeff Kosis, the lead on policy, throughout many of our efforts. But at the end of the day, we are not speaking to the entire nation, the Defense Department, all of the agencies. Having said that, we also fully acknowledge that GSA wears multiple hats in the acquisition space. So again, much of what we're thinking about is the kind of recommendations that we can make actionable by, again, having GSA take actions. All right, next, policies and practices. There has been some discussion that we could suggest legislation, that we could suggest regulation. But at the end of the day, we have a Congress, we have a FAR Council in our world. Also, there are pending FAR cases. One, as we've discussed earlier, has already been out in the Federal Register. We know the other one is coming, but in large part, we are attempting to limit our focus to things that are not necessarily going to require a legislative cycle or another regulation. That doesn't mean that's off the table, but that hasn't been our primary focus, and we think it makes more sense if it isn't. Next, there was a pretty strong view among our group that we should be encouraging innovation. Now, as we know in the space, using other people's ideas and not reinventing the wheel is a great idea, but the idea that the government would be innovating, and the model that has often come up is the model that many in our space are familiar with what we saw in innovation communities in a number of different other aspects of acquisition over the last decade or so. Another very, very powerful message that we've heard, and we think you'll hear this from the other subcommittees as well, is the concept of streamlining. In other words, if we come up with a perfect solution and it's so difficult that it's not going to get done, it's not a good solution. And we've heard all different articulations of the concept of easy. And I think, for example, you're going to hear terms like templates or playbooks or repeatable processes. But in any event, we understand that everything that we're doing is challenging, that businesses have competing priorities, that acquisition professionals have challenges, and if we aren't streamlining, we're probably going to fail. The next, this concept of accelerating demand and utilization. This is a pretty complicated concept, and we don't have all day, so I won't spend the rest of the day on it. But we did want to recognize that we're looking at this from both the buy side and the sell side. And to some extent, what we want is the government to buy more sustainable solutions, but we also want to stimulate markets for more sustainable solutions. So there's a fair amount in there with regard to this concept of demand and utilization, in addition to accelerating. Again, not binary, but not just moving the needle, but trying to move the needle with a little bit of dispatch or urgency. And then the last one, and you probably heard a little bit in terms of questions earlier from others in the committee, the concept of turning all of this into measurable progress. So there's progress, and then there's things that we can measure. And of course, as we all know, what gets measured gets managed, and we thought it was very, very important for measurement to be part of this with regard to climate and sustainability goals. So again, obviously a lot going on. We can talk about this more, but that's basically, I think, the gist of what we were trying to get to. Can I get the next slide, please? Okay. Now, as Luke mentioned earlier, we've been trying to manage a fair number of things to try to move down the train tracks. And I've mentioned some of these things earlier, but again, just a couple of quick reminders. In terms of the scope, we think, or we are trying to be informed by GSA as our audience, but we recognize that GSA has many hats. In addition, we're not trying to do pie in the sky, we're trying to do actionable outcomes. But the other thing, and we go back to advice we received from Jeff Kosis at the beginning, and that is, in a perfect world, we will proceed on 2 tracks. One would be focusing on more short-term or easier, or in the vernacular, the concept of the proverbial quick win, while also, to the extent that we've been created as a multi-year endeavor, seeing if we can take on something a little bit more meaty or more challenging or more long-term. But what we don't want to do is get sucked into only the super big thing and not do anything easy. So we're trying to proceed on 2 tracks. The last thing I want to mention here, I go back to the point I made earlier. It's a lot. And what we found is, and you probably heard this was very nicely demonstrated in the discussion of Oasis and Alliant. There's a lot of stakeholders sitting at this table. And so one of the hardest things that I think we're going to have to do under the broad umbrella of policy is we're going to have to make decisions about what we aren't or can't do and what we're going to let some other subcommittee do. Part of us thinks that probably the first thing that's going to have to go are almost all of the small business issues in the broadest sense. And remember, when I'm saying small business, I'm talking about small business, small disadvantaged business, women-owned business, hub zone, service-disabled, veteran-owned, the broad scope of what we think of as the FAR 19 type groups. But the reality is those issues are enormous, and they may simply be too big for our committee. Similarly, while implementation is incredibly important, many of the implementation issues are ultimately going to end up being the responsibility of the acquisition workforce or possibly the industry committee as well. But again, just kind of keep that stuff in the back of your mind. All right, if we could get the next slide, I'm going to turn it back to Luke, please.
Thanks, Steve. So just to recap, the exercise we undertook used a framework that assessed level of impact with level of effort. So low impact, low effort was considered a quick win. High impact, low effort was considered low hanging fruit. Low impact, high effort, we put to the side as not viable and not really worth further discussion. High impact, high effort, I would characterize these as leaps, long-term, big picture recommendations. So we're going to share some of the results of that exercise now. But again, I think Steve and I both agree we're at least another fruitful conversation away from being able to weave this into a narrative that's actionable. You'll see some here are more conceptual, some are considerations, others are more clearly delineated. So for low-hanging fruit, I think, Steve, you wanted to...
Yeah, so one of the first that we've talked about a fair amount in our subcommittee is that we have a number of existing tools where we don't have to reinvent the wheel. And the question is, are there levers that we can push to drive high volume, possibly lower value procurements to less harmful solutions? And just as an example, we know, for example, that the GSA environmental program aisle offers ready to go solutions that often carry echo labels. Could we make that a default solution and dramatically change high volumes of transactions? And again, there's potential warts on that, but that's an example of something that's relatively easy. Could be done with a leadership memo, a class deviation or the like, doesn't require anything else, but might impact a tremendous number of transactions. Back to you, Luke.
Thanks. So the following two essentially speak for themselves. Contribute to broader agenda to drive the public procurement community, and develop policies that involve assessment criteria to the range of product categories so that progress can be measured over time. I think ultimately we're going to wind up weaving these two into others, but I'll leave that for the committee at our next discussion. Next slide, please. So some of the items that were identified as quick wins were research best practices, conduct interviews with executives, review and assess the effectiveness of EPEAT, review and recommend practice tools such as AI and chatbots, keep in mind costs of recommendations, and to consider the use of existing tools such as whole building life cycle assessment, net zero, EPDs, Energy Star, and other ratings. Next slide. Ultimately, what we came up with is the tentative long-term big picture items all kind of bear a similarity to each other as well. Develop scalable policy framework for specific classes of materials and services. Consider more ambitious, expansive, and inclusive regulation. Build public and congressional support for ambitious federal action. I think we're, what we're going to have to navigate with the group is really putting some meat and some specifics on some of these. I think, Steve, you wanted to talk about the next one.
Right. And one of the things that we were trying to communicate with the different colors here are, again, the idea that we can't do everything. So just very, very briefly, we've talked a little bit about whether there is a role for us in increasing awareness or the utility with regard to assessment, reporting, and targeting with regard to the social cost of greenhouse gases. And just to take a half step back, keeping in mind that the primary FAR rule that is out for comment, with comments due on February 13th, basically requires the private sector to disclose, assess and disclose this information. You heard a lot of the fact in the earlier discussion today that Alliant and Oasis are doing something similar but not quite aligned. We fully understand that it is not our role to attempt to influence that rulemaking process, and we understand that we cannot interfere with it. But I think in the back of our mind, what we're thinking is, if the primary rule that's moving through the pipeline right now requires assessment, reporting, and targeting, there might be value in trying to engage the acquisition workforce and the private sector in getting ready for what's coming and to move up the learning curve more quickly. But again, we're having some discussions on an administrative side with regard to how we approach that. The last two that we want to mention here, again, are examples of the things that we felt like were almost elephant in the room type scale, but may in effect simply have to be ceded to other subcommittees. And again, I've mentioned both of these to some extent before. Could we get the next slide, please? And again, to the extent that we're cognizant of time and we understood that we are very, very quickly coming up against our deadline, one of the main things that we were hoping to do today is hear from the broader committee with regard to some reactions to what we're thinking in terms of how we choose our priorities and what our priorities are. The big next steps that we have, we think we're going to be able to agree on the mission statement relatively quickly. But we do need to start agreeing on our priorities and then move forward. We have somewhat of an interesting list with regard to future potential speakers, but again, it's still very, very diverse. And I can't speak for anybody else on the subcommittee or the committee, but at least personally, one of the most gratifying things about service on this committee and subcommittee so far has been the privilege to hear from all of these incredibly interesting, informative people. But the question is, at what point are we moving in a direction or simply being information sponges? And then finally, our ultimate challenge is to turn all of this into somewhat of a work plan so that we can come up with the expertise and the knowledge to turn these priorities into recommendations for actionable changes. Let me just say before I finish, once again, how lucky I feel to have Luke as the co-chair and how much I've appreciated the opportunity to not only meet with, but engage with our incredible subcommittee and, of course, the larger committee at large. Thanks so much.
I echo that sentiment, Steve. Really appreciate the work you and the subcommittee have done. It's a pleasure working with all of you.
All right. Well, that was very informative, and definitely want to thank this committee for starting it off and getting a lot of information together at really a short period of time. I took a photo of this recommendation that you all started at the top, and that does start with the rest of the work that you're going to be doing. And so I think it was tough, as you mentioned, but I think it's something that this committee has worked through and getting to be fine-tuned. With that being said, are there any, we'll take some questions at this time. You can raise your hand, or you can put also a question in the webinar chat to the side.
Yeah, and I just want to be clear that Luke has volunteered to answer all the questions.
Thank you, Luke. Let's see if we have any questions going up. And this is actually one that's coming up to the side. I think someone asked this question some time ago. Let's see. Well, actually, Steve, there was the last one that you actually had here. I'm going to go back to this and read this. Procurement policies and practices that encourages innovation and streamline the acquisition process to accelerate the demand and utilization of goods and services to achieve measurable progress on climate and sustainable goals. This is really right in line with the administrator's remarks initially why this committee was, one of the reasons why this committee was created. And so I think this is something that's going to be a good benchmark to work off. I thought that we also had the opportunity for this committee to engage themselves with the other committees as well too. And so I think we're going to look to really have a library of information that's going to be used for what was called low-hanging fruit and opportunities that's for long-term use. There's a question on the side as a suggestion. Let's see.
I see Ian's hand up as well. I'm sorry.
Was that okay? Let's go to Ann first, and then we'll go to the chat. Ann.
Oh, thank you. Excellent presentation, Stephen, Luke. Thank you. Question around the focus on GSA. So while the recommendation from your subcommittee is to make your recommendations to GSA and presumably apply those recommendations to GSA in the workforce, is the spirit of it, however, that there's going to be broader applicability at some point across other agencies to whatever policies you're proposing? Did you have a robust debate around that during your subcommittee meetings?
So I think that we have not fully resolved this issue yet, but I thought it was very helpful having Jeff in the room when we talked about these issues. As I expect you and many others know, I'd love everything that we do to apply to the entire federal government and the whole economy. But we have been reminded that this committee does not respond to either of those constituencies. So I think the short answer to your question is the broadest possible interpretation requires us to think about GSA in all of their roles, not only as the buyer of commercial product and service, but also as the policymaker, the chair of the FAR Council, the innovator, and the like. Mm-hmm. The question is how to exploit that, and I'll be the first to admit I don't really understand that, but going back to how I think you finished the question, I think the subcommittee's all over the place on that, and we'll probably be going back to Jeff Kozis on that more than once before we're done.
Yeah, and just to jump in as chair of the full committee, I think that this is something we'll through at the full committee, and ditto everything that you just said, Steve, in the spirit of your question, Ann, because our specific charge is to make recommendations to the GSA administrator. But recognizing that what the role that GSA plays and what a catalyst they are for spreading best practices across the government, certainly in my mind, as we make those recommendations, I'm thinking about how they could spread across the government more broadly.
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay, thank you. So there is a suggestion that came from Kristen. Said, just a suggestion, you may want to bifurcate changes to the existing policy versus recommendations on new policy. Kristen, would you like to expand on that a little bit?
Sure. I know, Steve, you were looking for input, and we are all trying to filter a lot of information into actionable ideas. So I just was thinking about, some of the shorter term, maybe looking at existing policy and is it working and can it be tweaked versus, new policy. Just might be another lens you can run your ideas through.
I think that's a great idea. We'll take that up at the next meeting.
Okay. Just moving forward in the interest of time, if there are no more questions, let me just take a moment to see if there are any questions. Wanted to actually just, again, thank this committee. Thank, of course, Steve and Luke for leading this effort. We do believe it is off to a great start. At this time, I don't believe I see any other hands. Boris, you came off of mute. Were you about to say something?
No, I thought I saw something from Nicole, actually. Nicole.
I think Nicole was just basically jumping on Kristen's bandwagon, but I can't speak for Nicole.
Gotcha. No, I would say that just to get us back on schedule, we want to go into a break here pretty quickly before we continue. One thing I wanted to say, a couple of reminders, is as we're getting the updates from each of the subcommittees, sometimes we'll use the term committee, subcommittee. Just to be clear, there is one committee, the GAFAC. Within the GAFAC, we have 3 subcommittees. And so that for our members of the public, just to make sure there's no misunderstanding here. So we have 3 subcommittees that are operating under the GAFAC. The GAFAC will make recommendations then to GSA. A second point for members of the public is we enable the Q&A feature. So at any time, feel free to put in any comments, questions that you have regarding what you're hearing. So this is your opportunity to engage a little bit, for us to actually take your information, and then we will share that with the members of the committee after the meeting. But this is an opportunity for you to do so. And then Stephanie, was there anything else before we go on a break here?
No, Boris, I think you covered everything. Thank you.
Alrighty, so let's go back in 10 minutes. And then after that, we're gonna go ahead and continue with the Industry Partnership Subcommittee report. So we'll be back in 10 minutes, and we'll start sharply at, let's see, 3:05 Eastern time. All right, 3:05, we'll see you back at 3:05. Back from break. And we are getting ready to get started. So I'm going to turn this back over to Cassius to introduce our next subcommittee group. Cassius, you are on mute.
Okay, sorry about it. Actually, I believe I'm turning over to Troy to introduce the next group.
That's okay. Either way, well, we have Industry and Partnerships up next, and we have Kristen and Farad.
Yeah, there we go. And to Steve's point, notice the color.
Yeah, we won't take that into effect here. So, hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Troy and Cassius. And I think we can go right to the next slide if you don't mind. So I'm certainly pleased to be here representing the Industry Partnership Subcommittee, along with my co-chair, Farad Ali, and the tremendous subcommittee you see here. I would like to take this opportunity to thank them for their engagement, and particularly for the level of expertise that they are bringing to the discussion. I think what's also worthy to note is that most, if not all, members of the full committee are serving on multiple subcommittees, so their commitment level is really just extremely impressive that they're willing and able to do that. So a little bit about our journey and is, we, like the other subcommittees, have had 3 public meetings since our last full meeting. We've had the administrative meetings in between. And we have also been on a kind of a journey of discovery and exploration as we try and fine tune what is our mission, what is our North Star, and how do we take this huge ocean of the supplier base for the federal government and make recommendations on how we can help make recommendations to the full committee for GSA on how can the industry partnerships be leveraged to drive the climate and sustainability goals. So as you can imagine, we've had a lot of robust discussions. We've leveraged online collaboration tools to help us narrow the focus. And I'm really pleased with the progress of the subcommittee and really excited to report out to the full committee here today. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to my partner, Farhad Ali.
Yeah. Thank you all for the participating in this. Thank you for the audience, the public, as well as the big committee, a big committee of this work. We've been really taking time to focus and get aligned. Like any other thing, you start going through the norming stage and focusing. So if you go to the next slide, we really want to provide some introduction and overview over the ways that we do work together during this process, since that we tend to work at least once, 2, 3 times a week, working on processes and working with the entire group. So we want to provide a status of all of that work today, share about the ongoing discussions that we've had around our mission statement, which is really critical because we thought that would be our guiding principle as we work within the barriers of our swim lane of industry partnerships, recognizing there's some in the continuity with all the other groups. And so as we start really developing the strength of what we do inside of our industry partnerships, we'll understand how we can better support the other groups on the other side of workforce as well as in policy. We also wanted to make sure that we share and discuss our areas of focus in a way that it's allowed to be used. We wanted to really iron it down to a place that people could say, hey, that makes sense, we want to go forward. So we took some time to really focus in on our mission statement, spent a lot of time on that. And if you go to the next slide, I'll be able to read it to you all. And, the Industry Partnership Subcommittee will focus on recommendations on how to best identify and engage and equip a broader and more diverse supplier base to achieve the government's goals of sustainability, environmental justice, economic equity, and a resilient domestic supply chain. Specifically, we will center out our efforts towards small, medium-sized, underutilized, underrepresented businesses, as well as innovation and new entrants. We really wanted this mission statement to provide a lot of space for people to feel like they could be engaged in this process. We didn't want to miss a group. We recognize that there's not parity inside of the government spending, and we wanted to recognize how parity could be looked at from the standpoint of environmentally, economically, supply chain concerns, and how to make sure that we can have everyone participate in the prosperity issues of parity and introducing concepts and working that. So we started working on a status update. And Kristen, if you don't mind focusing on that.
Sure. Just one comment on the mission statement. I think, our group is really sensitive to the fact of there is high level of commitment to climate and sustainability considerations, but there's also we're cognizant of the fact that we may present risks and barriers to being more inclusive. And we heard some of that discussion in the speakers today. That's certain segments of the supplier base are going to struggle with the stronger requirements. And that's really one of our hurdles is how can we help make recommendations that might help address that? And we've heard that loud and clear. We can go forward, please. Thank you. So a couple of things about process as we went through this. So as I mentioned, we've had 3 public meetings. We've had 3 opportunities to hear from speakers. We've heard from the Information Technology Council. We heard from the Federal Acquisition Services, and we heard from GSA itself. And that was really, really helpful in informing us and giving us a little bit more clarity around where we want to focus our efforts. But it also helped us realize that we need this is a huge supplier pool, and just because you're talking to one or two groups that might represent a subset of that supplier pool, you are not hearing from the full voice of that supplier pool. So that was really kind of a really good lesson for us, that we need to be really cognizant of who we want to hear from as we begin to refine our recommendations. And what we really heard loud and clear too is that there are strong pipes and conduits with the large suppliers in the federal marketplace. I think we heard that in the presentations today. Where the challenge is in effectively reaching and engaging some of the more non-traditional aspects of the potential supplier base. So that hence, in our mission statement, that clarification that we really want to focus on that subset as being important. I think it was also great to hear, it was pleased to hear from GSA in particular about, that the work of these subcommittees and the recommendations they'll make up to the full committee is really important. And they are anxious and excited to hear those recommendations. And so that, really that our work is meaningful and it's impactful, and, it's in the time that people are committing is well worth the effort. I think we've also learned, and there've been some pilots and some things done in the past to try and solidify engagement with some aspects of the supplier base, and some of them haven't worked necessarily as well as people would have hoped. And we think there's opportunity for us to learn from those experiences. And so as we go forward, how can we make recommendations that can be more impactful, more inclusive, and more successful, and not make some of the same, not necessarily mistakes, but go through the same growing pains that others have gone through. And then, we, as with the other subcommittees, the federal marketplace is vast, and we will continue to be challenged on how to narrow our focus, and hopefully we can use process tools. The facilitation from Boris and Stephanie has been great, so a thank you to them for their work. Some challenges and barriers and opportunities as we go forward. One of the things is, understanding that, we really want to have this regionally diverse and resilient federal marketplace, large, small, spread across the country, redundancy for impacts. And so that's something we want to make sure we keep within our lenses as we go through recommendations. A lot of discussion and questions around how do we actually measure progress and have effective feedback loops, both within the industry base and the government, about how these things are working. And I think we heard that today in the discussion. How do we know that reporting on greenhouse gas emissions is actually moving the needle? Like, do we have any of those feedback mechanisms in place? So I think that will be something that we'll be thinking about as we make recommendations and paths for implementation. We want to make sure that they're measurable and that there would be an expected positive impact that could be attained. But there's also a vast amount of opportunities and unexplored space that as we garner more information, we need to make sure we're putting that up onto our board and giving full consideration. So for example, is there an opportunity? You heard the discussion today on, small businesses becoming large businesses, small businesses struggling to meet some of these requirements. But is there an opportunity for the federal marketplace to be an incubator for emerging businesses before they even become small, to bring in more of those innovative practices and to expand the supplier pool? These are some of the questions that we're asking ourselves as we refine some of our recommendations.
Kristen, we also talked about really strengthening the things that we thought GSA was doing well, right? Recognizing where they are on the baseline of how to make sure that we can help them get good information to be more inclusive, and making sure the communication and the utilization of everyone. So this was really important to us to talk around how do we inspect what we expect, so that it can be robust and not put on the shelf, but really executed and becomes a part of the DNA of the work of it.
Yeah, definitely. And it's definitely a process. This is a process that we're going through. And I think you'll hear that from each of the three subcommittees. But, where we are very pleased, though, with our progress as of late, and that we start to get some real clarity and velocity around curating, I should say, some possible recommendations for the full committee. Boris, would you please advance? Great. So after much discussion, process prioritization, collaboration, we really were able to take a very large population of ideas and merge them into two key kind of areas of focus for this subcommittee. And the first priority area is around engaging with the purpose to expand the supplier base. And so we had a lot of discussion around outreach versus an engagement, information sharing versus capacity building. And so we want to ensure that any recommendations that we make are actionable and that would lead to a positive outcome relative to expanding the supplier base, whether that means helping make small businesses more capable of complying with climate requirements, access to training, those still yet to be determined. But you can see we have kind of curated that into recommendations that will be impactful to address the target market and broaden the pool of viable suppliers. While also, we want to make sure that anything we recommend becomes part of the suite of best practices, some of which already exist within the federal government and the federal marketplace, but also we can add to that list. The second area of focus is kind of where the rubber hits the road relative to, what are the measures, methods, and motivations among the supplier base? What metrics are truly meaningful? And meaningful in a way that they're achievable by a broad percent of the supplier base. You heard that today, a lot of folks requiring waivers. So if we're going to have metrics and targets, that are achievable, but then are also impactful, that they actually move the needle. We definitely want to make sure that methods are curated into those best practices. We want to ensure that people are participating in the federal marketplace, can be viable businesses and thrive while also contributing to the climate and sustainability goals of the federal government. And then we want to make sure that the incentives that are put in place, motivations, are relevant across the supplier pool, that they don't just apply to the large standardized businesses, that these incentives will actually motivate businesses to take more seriously their role in climate and sustainability as they participate in the federal marketplace. So these are our two areas of focus. And I think if we go to the next slide, we're not requesting a vote on our priorities at this time. But what we do envision is that we will be refining a list of recommendations within these two areas, and then really focusing on which one of those would have the greatest impact on the mission of the subcommittee, and then those recommendations would be put forward to the full committee for the April meeting. If we go, I think one more, and then if we have time, we can open it up for discussion. I think I already mentioned some of this. Another area of focus for us will now be to kind of curate a more specific speaker list that would tie to subject matter experts in the areas of the recommendations that we're looking at now. We definitely plan on leveraging an ease of implementation against a level of impact analysis so that we too can come up with short-term easy wins and maybe some longer-term, more substantial type impact recommendations. And then we're also very cognizant of it's not just recommendations, it's also including some level of potential solutioning and a path to implementation to be part of those recommendations as we go forward. And so that will be guiding the work that we do now between now and the next full committee meeting in April.
Yeah, we also talked about, Kristen, about making sure that we had the subject matter experts will also maybe be some of the partners that could be industry partners in this space, so that we can gain a greater understanding of how industry partners can help elevate the game of what's going on inside of GSA. So that's it. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and just in closing, I would just like to re-thank the committee members. We are really forming into a very strong subcommittee, and I'm really looking forward to the work that we're going to do over the next several weeks.
Yeah, and thank you, Kristen and Farad, and all of the members of the subcommittee. Outstanding presentation, and thank you for all the work you've done. I will open it up for questions, but I just want to kick things off with a question, hearkening back to what I said at the outset, is that words really matter. And there was some discussion in the subcommittee about kind of landing on the word engage versus just like communicate or outreach. And I thought that was a really fascinating discussion and really illustrative of the thought that your subcommittee and other subcommittees are putting into the words in their mission statement. So just wanted to kind of give you a chance to elaborate on kind of how you landed on that word engage and what it means.
Sure, I'd love actually to hear from some of the subcommittee members that were most passionate about that.
But I think Daryl and Keith would be really good to speak on that motion, but I will tell you that we have really robust conversations around making sure that we're able to catalyze this work to be able to be utilized. So the idea of being able to say we should do something, but not have a pathway forward to doing it is more pontification than action. And so this group has been really focused on not just speaking, but acting, and that the words and the processes are less around pontificating and statuesque commentation. It's like, how do we execute? Because the fear is there's so much opportunity going on that GSA may be the mothership of, and not having the ability to engage the business communities that we want to engage to get these opportunities will be a lost opportunity for all of us in the work that we do.
Yeah, sure. Anyone else from the subcommittee want? I see you guys have popped on here. If you want to chime in, this would be great.
Well, I'll say that, yes, Daryl did start the conversation on outreach versus engage, because as federal government contractors and former federal government contractors, we participated in many outreach events. But at the end of the day, what is the accountability? What is the real engagement? So we need to circle back around to ensure that there is some accountability. And so engaging was more of a action word than just outreach.
Great. Thanks, Gail.
Anyone else? I just think that's such an important distinction and shows the value of this exercise and going through and very carefully choosing the words for the mission statement. So if anyone else wants to weigh in on that, that's great. I
think Nigel has that.
Oh, I'm sorry. Who am I? I'm sorry. Nicole, your hand was up, and am I missing someone else?
I think Nigel's ready to
Nicole
go.
Nicole was first, and then I'll go after Nicole.
Okay, great.
So I have to say this was one part of the conversation that I appreciated deeply, that outreach is often talking to and involves one-way exchange. Engagement requires two-way discussion. And the committee was particularly pointed on the importance of that two-way dialogue so that we can learn from each other as we move forward, not assuming that any single entity has the answers, that we're learning together. So I thank you, Troy, for calling out this particular part of the conversation, because it was really rich and I thought very satisfying.
And directly related to that, I think from my perspective, the objective is to ensure that at the end of the day, what we're trying to create is a resilient supply chain for the federal government, right? So whether that's regional, whether that's socioeconomic, making sure that in the industries that we are driving, right, with the influence that federal procurement has in order to shape industries and really drive demand of these innovative, climate change and the climate change and solutions and services that we're trying to drive, that everyone gets a chance to participate in these economies and these industries of the future, but even more so that we are creating the foundation that the federal government has a diverse supply chain that is resilient, that we can have access to over the next 10, 15, 20 years. So that includes bringing new players to the table with their innovative solutions. Creative partnerships was a very important thing we talked about at the subcommittee. How do we bring the large entities that have economies of scale to the table, but also making sure those small minority women-owned businesses are afforded every opportunity to access the industry, but also grow within it in order to create that resiliency throughout the supply chain for a long period of time. So I think we need to keep focus on that. And thank you very much, Troy, for raising that part of the conversation.
Hey, Nigel, can you speak to specifically around EV charge so people can understand the conceptual knowledge of what you're talking around? I mean, like the application of EVs and how that could be an example.
Yeah, well, thank you. And we could talk EV, we could talk solar panels, we could talk, smart buildings, whatever it may be. The idea is that we're at the tip of the spear of a new technology, a new industry. And while large companies may have economies of scale and can apply it in much broader ranges, a lot of the companies that are coming up with this new technology and new innovative tools are smaller firms, small, mid-sized, whatever it may be. All right. So how do we make sure that if a company is not able to, let's say, manufacture the charging station, right? But they're engineering firms that can participate in the strategy and the rollout and the deployment and the implementation and the installation and maintenance of these things, that we can now train with technical assistance and all the wonderful programs that the federal government already has in giving them the tools to run a successful business to support the technical capability that they have. So they're around 10, 15, 20 years from now. And the small business, what we, in federal procurement terms, if you're a 25, 50 employee firm, you're a mom and pop, 10 years from now, can they have the scale and capacity to do these massive, larger contracts? So it's not just about, we're going to let, some, second, third tier subcontractors participate. It's how do we grow capacity with the real intent of building a resilient supply chain for the federal government over a long-term period of time.
Great. Anne, I think you're next.
Thanks, Troy. I've been struck by how thoughtful the subcommittees have been in thinking through the mission area and mission statement and focus areas. It's challenged me to start thinking through whether, based on what I've heard from the other subcommittees, whether that might inform and impact where our subcommittee on workforce focuses. Not necessarily the mission statement changing, but perhaps focus areas, because it occurred to me as we write our initial reports, we want to ensure that there's some thread weaving the three areas together. And so I think we should challenge ourselves to think through, are we creating that appropriate sort of thread between the three subcommittees? Not that they have to be identical, but just complementary.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. And I think, as we're starting to get clarity, now we can see that. I think when we first started, I don't think the thought of the golden thread, like we were all, but I think it's a very valid point right now.
It's Antonio. I think one of the things I'd add into that, to what Ann said and others have said already, some of that connectivity piece that feels like it's starting to come out is this whole notion of how we can be almost a demonstration project of what is possible in a new industry as it's developing, and how the federal government can not only take a leadership role through the GSA GAP-FAC process, but I think done well and done right, we have the ability to be a catalyst for other parts of the federal government, as well as state and local governments, where they have opportunities to exercise similar type of missions and similar types of objectives, so that we're not only building that group that can move forward and do the work, that's here in the near term and in the future, but that we're also through this, I'm calling it a demonstration project, not in the normal way, but just as an example of what could be done, that we're then also saying to that next generation of entrepreneurs who may not necessarily be thinking entrepreneurs, they might be thinking, go and be a cog in one of the bigger industries, that they too might have a path, and their ingenuity, their creativity can come to bear through these types of vehicles and these kind of initiatives. So I think there's a lot that is very much possible with the work that we're doing, and really excited to hear the third subcommittee and what other connectivity pieces might be there.
Daryl, just to jump in really quick, I think it's also a good time, and if you can let the committee know about your most recent change in your role. And then we can come up to you, Kim, but I just want to at least have, I'm sorry, not said Daryl, but Antonio, to talk about your most recent title change with the Small Business Administration.
Oh, yeah. So thanks very much, Cassius. So right at the end of the calendar year, I was asked by our administrator to take on a new role. So I've officially vacated the role of the Associate Deputy Administrator for Government Contracting and Business Development. Some of you may have worked with Mr. Larry Stubblefield, who's been leading our veterans program for the last probably 6-7 years. He has now actually taken on the role that I was in. And so the administrator asked me to lead up the Office of Field Operations, which is where all of our district's offices are located and our regional centers, as in the role of the Director of Strategic Planning and Economic Development, with the obvious goal of trying to make some bigger, better things happen at the local level all across the country. As those of us familiar with the federal contracting space know, it's collapsed into certain markets much more heavily in terms of activity. And our goal is to make the country as a whole as strong as it can be, and to build that sustainable backdrop so we can be the things that we can be as a country. So looking forward to that role. I'm just literally like a week or so into it now.
Congratulations again, Daryl. I think it's a great asset for this committee, and I just want to make sure we had a chance to acknowledge and let your peers know about it.
And thanks very much. And whenever I talk to Daryl again, I'm gonna tell him you've been thinking about him.
Okay, I owe him a call.
Yeah, I got you.
Thank you. Kimberly?
Yeah, thanks so much, Cassius. And I just wanted to maybe come back to something that Ann said, as well as Nigel, one on kind of the thread, the golden thread through all the committees, and making sure kind of the work that we're doing has some complementary aspects of it. And what Nigel said is this is really about kind of shoring up the supply chain and resiliency for the government overall. And I think there's a couple of key themes here as we look across our committees. One is on that engagement and ensuring that we have a good feedback loop, so that when we're recommending something, that we have a way to see how that stuff is working, right? Or at least GSA has a way to really see, okay, these are things that we're recommending. How are they actually being implemented, at the end of the day? And are we seeing some measurable impacts, right? I think we heard earlier that when something's measurable, it gets managed. And so that way we really know that there's going to be some progress made. And then the final thing I would say is that if we're really focused in on kind of incorporating, sustainability and climate related activities into what we're doing, we also want to make sure that we're not inadvertently putting barriers in place for some of those supply chain, people that will be applying for these grants or awards are not going to be able to get them, right? So making sure that we're not inadvertently putting in some barriers that are unachievable for them, that we're making sure that we have a pathway for them to either tier into these processes or to be able to partner in some way. And I know we've been thinking about that across the committees, but I think we need to be very thoughtful that as we're putting into place our recommendations, that we are cognizant of ensuring that we get some feedback so that we're not inadvertently putting barriers in place that don't allow for that resiliency to happen, or they inadvertently limit the types of, businesses that are able to apply for some of these grants or awards.
And thank you for that, Kimberly. That's why it's so important to share that information and this type of group, so we can spread that information and let other people know. So thank you for sharing that. Hey. All right.
And any other questions here for the Industry Partnerships Subcommittee?
I think we're good. And then it's just a thank you to you, Troy and Cassius, for attending the subcommittee meetings and you know, providing guidance and clarity. That's been very helpful as well. So much more work to do.
Yeah, thank you, and all the subcommittee members. So Boris, I'll leave it up to you to proceed. I think we're just a few minutes ahead of schedule. Should we go ahead and proceed to the final subcommittee?
Yep.
Okay. All right, Cassius, I think I'll leave you to.
Okay. Sure. Sorry for that. My lab is he does not like a lot of wind and storms, and so he's trying to get out of here, Jack. Our final committee for today is our acquisitions workforce subcommittee mission, and this actually part is being led by Daryl Daniel, who's the chair, and also Nicole Darnell, who's our co-chair. And if you all have the opportunity to take us and lead us into our last discussion for today, and then we'll have a couple of questions and answers after your presentation.
Surely, thank you. And it's been exciting to hear from the other committees. I'm not a member of the other committees, so it's really great to hear what's going on with their work. Can we go to the next slide? Our committee members, I am really excited to report that we have a great deal of talent and knowledge. I, on the other hand, am learning a lot about the topic and am being guided by some great minds. And you see all the names here. My co-chair, Nicole, will jump in as necessary to fill in some gaps when we talk. First, I want to say thank you to Steve and Luke for accommodating me in my schedule. I had to travel today, so I missed some of the meeting, but we were glad to get in and get settled so I can make this presentation. So again, thanks also to Troy and Cassius for being present at our committee meeting and guiding us and really making sure that we get some of the benefit from what's going on with the other committees, because as was stated just a few minutes ago, it's important that there's a thread that connects everything that we do. And it was always important to us, at least to me, that we were in alignment with the other committees and with the commission, the committee as a whole. So I think what you'll hear today is some key things and similar themes that you heard from other committees. Next slide. So our work got started pretty early, and we focused really on guest speakers. And the first few meetings was trying to get our hands around some of those key themes and have the speakers really bring to us the current state of things. Our first two meetings, our first meeting, we asked Katie Newhouse to present on kind of workforce overview and workforce and sustainability issues. Thankful to Anne, who was able to secure Katie. And Anne, I don't know if you have a minute, maybe you could summarize very quickly some of the comments and key points that Katie brought up. Anne? Maybe Anne stepped out for a minute. Oh, there she is. I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I didn't step out. I got bumped out of this computer. Anyway, so I'm sorry, Daryl. I missed what you were asking.
No problem. Katie Newhouse. So remember, you introduced Katie and you brought her to our first meeting, and I was just asking if you would just summarize some key points that Katie made to our group.
Yeah, Katie Newhouse is a former Amazon employee and spent many years in the technology industry. was recently recruited into the Council of Environmental Quality, CEQ, in the White House. She's been focused on determining, sort of from the perspective of the end user or the acquisition employee, what are some of the pain points around successfully implementing sustainability or climate policies. And she's done some in-person interviews, I think used some tools through GSA to survey the workforce, and has determined some interesting findings. Like one example is a big challenge for the workforce is around how do you prioritize all the competing policies, not just in the environmental space, but just across the board. And it's less a matter of training them in certain policies, but now that we know them, how do we prioritize? And so we're going to leverage Katie's good work, I think, to dig into that a little bit further to ensure that whatever our focus areas are, they're informed by ultimately the workforce telling us what the pain points are and the challenges.
Thanks, Ann. And also during that first meeting, we spent time on our mission statement, and Ann actually led us, facilitated that discussion. And you'll see on a subsequent slide what our mission statement and how it's really become our North Star for the work that we're going to do. Our second meeting, I don't know if I got the dates there correct, but anyway, our second meeting was with our guest speaker, Brennan Conway, addressing climate change and acquisition solutions, and looking at product search and acquisition initiatives and post-award deliverables, how those things are evaluated. Fortunately, our co-chair, Nicole, asked Mr. Conway to speak to us. I don't know, Nicole, could you just provide some highlights on that?
Yeah, sure, I'm happy to. Brennan's a procurement analyst with GSA, and he talked with us about two really important items. The first being how GSA's green procurement compilation can be used to accelerate sustainability decision-making. So this is really the committee thinking towards how do we utilize existing tools that are in place, especially the good ones. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. Now, in some instances, we may need to stretch the wheel or grow the wheel, but getting a handle on what is there already that can be utilized. He also discussed intersections with SF Tool, which is a marketplace platform where procurement officers can identify green products, pain points associated with how that tool is being used, opportunities for greater integration. And he really walked through the different capabilities that it might afford federal acquisition. And then he discussed how GSA is considering options for how federal acquisition, the workforce itself, could integrate vendors' climate risk and adaptation plans as part of their acquisition decisions. That really builds on what we heard on earlier today related to our two guest speakers, and thinking through what do we do with these climate risk plans? How do we make sense of them? It's one thing to acquire them and to require vendors to provide that information, but then what does GSA, what's the next step for utilizing this information? And he helped us begin as a committee to think through those initial steps of what might be possible.
Exactly. And if there are any other committee members who might like to jump in, please feel free. So we then took a pause to look at and evaluate what we heard from our guest speakers. And we used the next meeting to really think about various current state of the industry issues, barriers, priorities. We also use this time to start thinking about our priorities for the committee and how we would organize them. We also spent some time talking about credentials and certification and technology and best practices, and there's still a whole lot of work to do. We've done a lot of work, and we've got through quite a few things, and we want to share with you on the next slide. The next slide. Our mission statement. So, after several meetings, we determined that the wording here got to what we felt was important and would be our guiding light, for the work that we do. What I got through all of this is there was this need to help the acquisition workforce, acquire goods and services in a manner that really reduces the negative impact on the environment and also promotes sustainability. We use those words and other thoughts to come up with how best to empower and equip the federal acquisition workforce to prioritize environmental outcomes and promote sustainability throughout the acquisition lifecycle. There was some discussion around the words as we wordsmith things here and there, but we came to this consensus, and I'm really pleased. Next slide. So outside of our mission statement, we spent most of our time focused and evaluating what would be our key priorities. We were fortunate to have Nicole lead us through and facilitate a discussion around the priorities, the process of determining this prioritization. We, like the other committees, talked about low-hanging fruit and how we could best achieve things that were implementable and not just offer recommendations, but really focused on how to put together a package of priorities that would be meaningful to the workforce. We also thought about how we need, as we develop these priorities, to listen to the workforce, to focus, to put together a panel or a task force so we can actually determine best by hearing from them, and hearing from them and how they, we would not be putting any barriers, but making it simple, making it an easy process for them to move forward. The other piece was ensuring that they are acquiring the core competencies for evaluating and determining sustainability measures. We had a great deal of discussion around that. The whole word of core competencies, that theme, what they have now and what they might need to acquire through additional training or even credentialing. So there's still a lot of work to be done there, but we do see that as a necessary tool.
And Daryl, let me just jump in for a second. I think one of the important conversations that our subcommittee had related to this notion that it's one thing to have a policy in place. Doesn't mean the policy is going to get implemented, however. And so when we think about the role of the federal acquisition workforce, it really is the implementation arm of policy. So what does that arm need to be successful? And as a starting point, you need level setting related to the workforce feeling competent in their knowledge, possessing the credentials needed, understanding the nature of the problem and how to begin tackling the problem. And that really gets at this notion of ensuring and acquiring core competencies within the workforce around sustainability and climate impacts. And then the next part relates to this notion of taking it a step further empowering and equipping. So what are the levers and tools that are in place that they can lean on to help accelerate their work in sustainable acquisition? And there are a lot of different layers to this, a lot of different strategies, but we felt that it was these two general areas that were probably the most important for us to tackle first.
Exactly. Next slide, please. So as Nicole just discussed, we centered our priorities around these two themes. How to get this kind of a shared understanding of sustainability and the whole credentials and core competencies. And we came up with number one priority is to identify the essential pathways needed to make environmental and sustainability a core competency in federal acquisition. I believe there's going to be additional discussion around, the need for credentials or the need for additional training or how to see best practices in training modules from other government agencies. Again, we are focused on the workforce and how best to suit their needs as they're being asked, to evaluate based on sustainability. So one of our next steps, I believe, will be to listen to them and trying to figure out again how best to serve their needs. The second major theme, as Nicole pointed out too, is what are the tools? What can we do that will make this implementable beyond just recommendations? So we wanted to, as I said, keep it simple, make it easy, to execute, and move away from all the complications. So this will, have a great deal of success, and so therefore we go to identifying the critical levers needed to empower the acquisition workforce to prioritize environmental outcomes, promote sustainability with the least amount of effort. And we know there's still going to be a lot of effort, but this is, this is just addressing the needs of the procurement professionals. So with that, our committee, as I said, we came to some consensus around these two themes. We are interested to hear from the other subcommittees to ensure that the priorities that we've stated are in alignment with the policies and programs of the other committees. Next slide, please. We are interested in requesting from the full committee approval to start work on our top priorities. I'm not quite sure how the voting works here, but we are asking for authority to move forward with these, particularly if the committee feels there is alignment with the other work.
Daryl, I'd like to just add a small nuance because I think the other committees were really great at describing the different focal areas that they've been discussing within their thematic areas. And we certainly have begun those discussions on focal areas within each of these priorities. But we felt it important, since we had landed on our two key priorities, to get approval from the broader committee before we really start digging in and developing those focal areas.
Thanks, Nicole, and thanks to you and Daryl for all your great work here. And maybe if I could just jump in here with a bit of commentary on what the significance of the voting would mean, just to help inform the rest of the committee. And that this is our first foray into voting, which is very exciting. But the purpose here is really just to give the backing of the full committee, the imprimatur of the full committee, if you will, to what the subcommittees are doing. So to the extent that the subcommittee is ready to move forward, I think that's great. and to be clear, this is not precluding any subcommittee from taking on other issues as they see fit. It doesn't preclude a subcommittee from exploring a priority and deciding we're hitting a brick wall. We think our efforts should be better focused elsewhere. Again, this is really just to give the backing of the full committee, the confidence of the full committee that these are valid priorities to explore. And with respect to the mission statement, that we're fully supportive of the subcommittees and how they've kind of identified each their North Star of what they're going to pursue. So again, just if that helps clarify things, we've got a long way to go with this committee and the subcommittees. There's a lot to explore. We're not precluding anything at this point. And again, we're not limiting in any way the discretion of the subcommittees and to what they explore. But I do think that it's important with the thought that each subcommittee goes through, if they've identified priorities that they want to pursue, present them to the full committee, that it really helps move the ball forward if the full committee can vote and give backing on what they've identified. So I hope that's helpful in kind of clarifying the process here. I'm happy to, and Cassius also to entertain questions on that. And I think GSA from the FACA perspective could help clarify the process. But just wanted to offer those overall comments on what the voting would mean.
Our final slide here is just our next steps, and wanted the committee and any members of the public to know that our next guest speaker is Holly Elwood. Again, our work plan is far from finished, so we're still needing to hear from others in the industry. And as I said, we also are looking to put together a panel of acquisition professionals to hear from them, and probably spend a great deal of time listening to them and hearing some of the barriers or challenges that they currently have. And also, as I said, explore some best practices throughout other agencies.
Hey, Daryl.
And that's it.
Daryl, just to jump in, I know a couple of members need to drop off before too long. So what I wanted to do is just following up on what Troy said. If we're ready to go ahead and move to a vote, just as Troy explained it, that was spot on. What we will do is we're going to use the chat feature. So David Kucheni, I think he's going to type up a chat to just say, basically, this is a vote for the acquisition workforce subcommittee. And then David, you can go ahead and type that in the chat. And then what we're going to do is we're going to give you just a couple of minutes here for each member of the GAP FAC that's here. I think I counted about 20 right now because all the folks weren't able to stay through the end. But let's go ahead and take a minute right now. And in the chat, you can just say yes if you approve, just as the subcommittee presented, if you approve them pursuing these two priority areas. And so we'll go with that. We'll go ahead and open it up right now. And this is only for the members of the GAP FAC. So only members of the GAP FAC will be able to vote here. All right. Does anybody else need to vote? It looks like everyone that's still around was able to vote. And it looks like it's a yes vote for the acquisition workforce subcommittee to continue on. So back to you, Daryl and Nicole, to close out your comments.
Sure, just one final statement. I think we benefit as a committee by having the chairs of the other committees on our committee. So we get to learn a lot from each other, and we appreciate your support and all your knowledge. Again, just a great, talented group of people, and I appreciate working with them.
Me too. I appreciate the work of the entire committee, and Troy and Cassius, you've been really terrific in helping guide us along, and Boris and Stephanie, the support you've provided us is insurmountable. Could not do this without you. Thank you.
You're welcome. So back to you, Troy. I think we have some time for some Q&A and comments for this subcommittee from the other subcommittee. So it'd probably be good to entertain some additional. We definitely have the time.
Yeah, sure. And just want to second what Nicole's saying though about Boris, you and Stephanie. Well, as I said at the outset, we have so much to cover and it's daunting for us. You make it so much easier by handling all the logistics and teeing things up for us. Thank you so very much for that. But Boris, are you, sorry, just to clarify, do you think, should we move on just to general public engagement, or are we still on with the subcommittee here? And
yeah, we're still with the subcommittee, so we're ahead of schedule, so we can definitely entertain some comments and questions and reactions from the other subcommittee members.
Okay. To layer something on top before we open it up. In looking at our priorities, we talk about identifying, but I think that word is actually richer than what we've described, getting to this point that words matter. So I just want to provide a little bit of intuition behind that. Our intention is to develop a roadmap or a blueprint. So the identification part is really a really important part of that. But what we mean is more than that. And I think that this really resonates with what I heard from the other committees, that this isn't about just identifying issues, that we're really eager to begin thinking through how the issues can be addressed and to develop a roadmap for solving those issues.
I agree, and I think that's one of the other golden threads that have starting to appear in our tapestry.
Yeah, I agree. I see it as a common thread across all the subcommittees that everyone's very focused on coming up with ideas, but then thinking through, well, how could you actually implement this? And that's great to see in the world of policy. I think this town is Anne knows well, and others too, full of people who have great ideas, who like to generate ideas, but they don't have familiarity with how those ideas are actually implemented. And so what I love about this committee is that everyone is gravitating towards immediately thinking about the implementation side of things. That's awesome. Any other comments for our acquisition workforce subcommittee?
I just say Nicole did a phenomenal job facilitating all the discussions around mission statement and focus areas, and teaching us all the technology on how to do it.
We had a great time with Jamboard.
Yeah.
It's hard to brainstorm in a virtual environment. It's really hard, and it's hard to encourage inclusivity. And fortunately, we have some pretty fantastic tools out there right now to help us. And the committee did great following along and engaging. It was a very gratifying conversation.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's true for all the subcommittees. So thank you so much. So Boris, I guess so. Unless there are any other comments here, I'm scrolling through to see if anyone has their little electronic hand up. Should we turn towards seeing if any of our public participants want to weigh in now with either question or comment?
Yeah, we can take the next couple of minutes here, and we've been using the Q&A feature, so we've had a couple of questions come in there, but also in the public, if you will. So in my team, David Kochenik is going to be watching out for a raised hand. So you have the ability to raise your hand if you're a public participant. And so Dave will temporarily promote you to be on the panelist view for Zoom webinar, and then you can ask a question or make a comment. So we're going to give you that opportunity right now. So we'll take a couple of minutes here, and Dave is going to be watching for anyone who's raising their hand. In the public participants, we have a total of 14 attendees right now on the public side. And if there's anybody, this will be the time to do that. We'll just take a couple of minutes here. Okay, Dave, are you seeing any hands raised?
No, Boris, I do not see any hand raised from the public attendees.
Okay. All right, well, that being the case, we're gonna go ahead and continue on our, and then just as a reminder, you have the opportunity to submit comments via GSA, via our gapfac@gsa.gov email, as well as our regulations.gov public comment docket. So you're able to find us there in regulations.gov for any public comments you may have. I think, Troy, we're going to go ahead and move to just your closing remarks. And then I wanted to give Jeff and Crystal also an opportunity if they want to just give a couple of closing comments for the committee. So back to you, Troy.
Yeah, well, I'll be very, very brief and then hand it over to Cassius. Just thank you so much, all of the subcommittees, for going so far, so fast. I mean, the launch of all of this happened pretty rapidly, and everyone just jumped in with enthusiasm and intellectual curiosity and the best of public service at heart. And as noted, like ran right up to the holiday break, came right back after the new year. So it's been a great effort so far. I'm just so impressed by what each and every subcommittee has done. And it's just been a pleasure to be able to listen in and observe what you're doing. And I have high hopes for moving on into the new year and regrouping in April, where we hope to have our first recommendations teed up for the full committee. So just want to give a hearty thanks to you all, and I'll hand it over to Cassius. And then yes, it would be great to Crystal and Jeff, if you want to weigh in, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Troy. And I also just want to thank everyone for your time, your attention, your participation today. I think it was very fruitful, and we actually learned a lot. Was able to share a lot of great ideas. Of course, thank you to the staff. Also, Jeff, thank you for having, which is such a great team in place, along with Boris and Stephanie. They've been very helpful. The chairs, the co-chairs, and the committees themselves, everyone has been pouring in and really sharing ideas. And I think that's something that's been very a huge benefit to everyone. It's just sharing ideas and talking and having this type of communication. And so we're looking forward to the next opportunity when we convene together. I'd like to turn it over to Crystal Brumfield, our Associate Administrator, and see if there are any words. But wanted to thank you too, ma'am, for first reaching out and starting to have something that is historic. And I think we're on our way.
Thank you.
And if I could be specific also too, I'd like to thank Troy specifically as the chair of this committee. She has been putting a lot of yeoman's work and time into play. So thank you, Troy, for your leadership as well too.
Well, thank you, but nothing compared to what others have been digging into. But thank you. It's been my pleasure to participate in everything. I've been dropping in as an observer into as many subcommittee meetings as I can. I think I've hit pretty much all of them except maybe the end of a couple, and it's just been extraordinary to be able to join in and watch what's going on. Appreciate it so much. And Cassius, you are a tremendous partner in this, and couldn't do it without you. So thank you as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Cassius. Thanks, Troy, and thanks, team. I also want to thank the entire committee membership for their time and attention and expertise today and up to this point. You know, it's really interesting when you create a gap fact of individuals with different backgrounds. You never really know how things will start to align and unfold and evolve. And I can tell you today, it's very encouraging to see where you have the private sector and the public sector come together and it collides in a very meaningful, intentional way, really to advance our government, right? We are all American citizens, and it's our duty to really make sure that things are functioning. Our government is working in the most advanced way as possible. And so I am excited about the thoughts and ideas and the thought leadership that you all have exhibited today and throughout this process so far. And I'm extremely excited about what's to come. And I'm looking forward to seeing the final recommendation. So thank you all again for all of your efforts and of course for your valuable time. And I'll turn it to my colleague, Jeff Kosis.
Thanks, Crystal. Before I comment, Steve, you had a hand up a moment ago. Was there something you wanted to add?
It was more of a trivia question than anything else. Someone had asked what, if anybody knew what the peak number of public attendees today was. I actually thought we had a pretty significant number in the first hour or two, but I was wondering if Boris or Stephanie or someone on their team might know.
Yeah, we're watching that. I think it was right around 3:30. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, fantastic. So really tremendous meeting today. Thank you. I think many of you got a whole lot out of Tiffany and Paul's presentations today. I had asked them to come in and speak and talk with you all. And I was so pleased because each of the subcommittees asked the questions and explored the topics I was hoping would come up off of their presentation. The policy subcommittee went right into questions about, okay, that's great, but these are not the highest impact areas in terms of emissions, and where and how does GSA plan to take it further? And that's the type of questions that we would love to explore with the policy committee. So exact set of issues. The industry subcommittee picked up on Tiffany's comments about the reactions of the small business community, and we're asking questions about how anything we're doing is going to impact small business. In many ways, that is one of the great challenges of dealing with these issues. Anytime we're going to change requirements, add requirements, limit offerings, there's going to be a small business impact. And so making sure that we're doing that thoughtfully, that we're having the conversation. That's why it was so important to have an industry small business committee. And it's outstanding that you all were asking those questions. The workforce subcommittee started going down the road of, okay, GSA, you've got the data. Do you know how to analyze it? Do you know what to do with it? What is your next step? How do you think about it? The exact set of questions that we're hoping that you ask and help us think about. And when I turn to where we closed and with the priorities and where the workforce team had gone, you're thinking about that. You're anticipating exactly those types of issues. All three of the subcommittee teams' presentations showed a lot of work, a lot of thought. You're tackling tough issues. You're thinking through these things. But I want to specifically single out the workforce subcommittee, because those priority recommendations, those have such enormous potential. There is so much that's interesting in them. And I think it hits the very things that we talked about at the beginning. The recommendations there, if this goes where it seems to have the potential to, it's not only actionable, it's things GSA could not do on its own because we don't have the expertise and the knowledge of how to tackle some of these things. But the potential that's there is enormous. There's obviously a lot of work to be done, a lot of further conversations that we need the workforce team to have. Fantastic that you're going to talk with Holly at your next meeting. We need you to talk with the Federal Acquisition Institute. We need you to learn more about where GSA is going in updating and changing the acquisition curriculum. We need you to know where we're all going in terms of what a credential may mean to us. For the other teams, I think you're maybe a meeting behind, but if we get any similar types of recommendations, this committee can far exceed any expectation that we went into. And we went in expecting a lot, but there's potential to totally blow all that away. And several of you recognize the tremendous work that Boris, Stephanie, and team have been doing in recent weeks. Let me just let all of you know, each of them has also been doing enormous projects in their full-time job over the last few weeks. Some very major goals and priorities for OMB and for the administration. So they're incredibly talented people, but this is not their only job, and they are doing amazing work in many other spaces at the same time. Absolutely, yes, they are rock stars. With that, let me stop talking and give it back to Boris and Stephanie to offer any final comments and close this out.
Well, thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Crystal. And really is a pleasure working with you both. It's definitely a dream job for me. And thank you so much for this committee and the work that you're putting in here. We really, really appreciate all of the many hours. Lots more to go, but I feel like coming out of this meeting, I know as a DFO, I feel very good about where we're headed. And so we're going to be continuing our pace of meeting every other week for the subcommittees. We do that in the first and the third week of the month. If you're in the public, you are more than welcome to sit in and see what we're doing at the subcommittee level. You go onto our website. If you just Google GSA Gap FAC, you very much end up right on the top hit would be our website. And there we are able to post our meeting minutes. We're able to post recordings of the meetings. You actually can watch them, presentations, agendas. And then we're also able to register to attend those subcommittee meetings where you can see what's going on and offer comments as well. We're also going to be looking at our next full committee meeting towards the latter part of April. So there'll be more communications on that. But in the meantime, there's a lot of work to continue on. And I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie here just to see if there's any other thing in your mind, but also an opportunity for you, Stephanie, to weigh in on what you saw today.
No, I don't have anything further to add. I just think it was a very engaging and wonderful conversation as always. I want to thank Jeff, Crystal, and Boris, Troy, and Cassius. I mean, it's just a wonderful, wonderful time and opportunity to be able to just be with all of you. I have mentioned at time or two, I feel like I want to just throw up my hands sometimes in some of the conversations that you all are engaged in. I'm telling you, I am just very, I'm just going to put it out there, blessed to be working with some phenomenal individuals. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Stephanie. And then also the support team, David, Adam, Skylar, that doing tremendous work for all of this to be possible here today and all the work that we've done so far. Much more to come, but I feel really good about our position right now as a committee. And I just want to let you know that we'll make sure that we post all these materials on our website. We got the presentation, all of the things that were discussed today. And then we also put the actual recording of the meeting once we go through our process within GSA. Available for any other questions, the gapfac@gsa.gov is the email inbox. Anyone in the public that wants to communicate with us. Otherwise, we're just going to say this meeting is adjourned. Thanks, everybody, for joining today.
Thank you.